Good morning, everybody. This is Nevin Gusak, your host of the Politically Homeless podcast. We're doing another episode of Wilderness of Mirrors, which is kind of my show within the show with Alex Benesch, who's a podcaster, writer, and research deep in the heart of Germany. Welcome back, Alex. How are we doing today?
I'm doing fine, doing fine. I was reading your latest piece, latest Substack piece. It's very long, very detailed. So we decided to talk about the Democrats. We talk about Biden, we talk about Kamala Harris, and we talk about Mr. Walz, and trying to reverse engineer what their strategy is. What the overall plan seems to be, and also how the right wing is doing a lot of the wrong things. There's this kind of a smart way of understanding, that game plan and to come up with something. There's a good way, but there's also a bad way. And I think that over the last couple of days, I understand now better than before that there's sort of a left wing brand, a left wing type of not just a left wing agenda of creating this one world system of having these interconnected economies and have a ton of migration, but there's also like a right wing version of this. There's kind of similar, but there's also differences. I mean, we've heard these arguments before. In the Cold War, it was like the security argument. I think not many people really spoke it out fairly well. There was, for example, Professor Carol Quigley in his very long book, Tragedy and Hope. Pretty much at the end of the book, he talks about this. It doesn't make sense anymore to have a large world war, a traditional war, because you can't really win it with acceptable losses. Isn't this sort of a cartel, he asked? Isn't this sort of a cartel that was just happening, right? And don't these superpowers need to come to an unspoken agreement, or maybe a more structured agreement how to run the world? The Soviets, they would dominate that part of the world. The Anglos would dominate the other part of the world. And couldn't we have trade? And maybe we have a one world system in the end where everybody just sort of gets along without annihilating each other. So that was kind of a security argument. Then you have from the left the traditional Marxist Leninist argument, making everything socialist, having a world system, no more war, no more poverty, all that stuff. But it's like both brands, I think, are very dangerous. Now the left version of this, we know how socialism is in the real world, so we understand those dangers. But if you talk about kind of a right-wing agenda, a right-wing version of this one world system, using security arguments or whatever, you could end up with sort of a global kind of fascist system, or something that Professor Quigley warned about. Because if you read that carefully, Tragedy and Hope at the end, he basically says that there's kind of a hidden danger in this, right? Because if you have two superpowers and they have a hidden agreement, they may stage some proxy wars every now and then to scare everybody, to keep up the impression that these superpowers are really hostile to each other, keep everybody scared, keep every normal country in line, and also keep up the fear of a full-blown world war, just terrorizing people constantly with nuclear, the threat of nuclear weapons. And that's not a nice world system either. If you have proxy wars that you can start at will, supplying weapons, creating a border crisis here, creating a little invasion there, like Korea or Vietnam, right? That's also a kind of a terrible system. So we should talk about the Democrats and also kind of the strange ways that the right wing is countering, the Democrats when it comes to these things.
Yeah, no, the interesting introduction. The way I see the world in regards to international competition or rivalries, as opposed somewhat to Quigley, I see, as opposed to Quigley, Professor Carol Quigley, is there are several competing power centers. I look at one bloc led by Russia and China in alliance with a variety of other countries or governments like Venezuela, Iran, Cuba, North Korea, China, Russia, obviously, etc. And then I view in the West a sort of masochistic, contradictory economic and political elites, really the government, particularly in the United States, dominated by the economic elites and bullying and controlling the political elites more often than not, as another power block. And basically, each power block uses one another when something is needed or when it's convenient.
Oh yeah.
However, when they're out at the end of the day, the Russians and the Chinese seek to ultimately displace our political and economic elite in totality, or force them to collaborate in a world where Russia and China have domination. Whereas, of course, opening up the discussion, where do I see our power centers? There are many power centers in the United States in both parties, and there are some that have tremendous power over both parties. I tend to look at our politics as through the lens of ideological groups, as economic interest groups, and political constituencies. Um, you know, so yeah, I think it's going to be. I think we're going to have an interesting discussion on who the Democrats are. My opinion of Biden, Walz, and Kamala Harris. They don't. It's not going to be a talk where I'm going to be like, rah rah Harris, rah rah Walz, or everything that they've advocated or voted for is wrong on the other end. Our job on this program is, again, to give analysis from a politically homeless point of view, according to my worldview of radical civic nationalism, not that of the far left, and not of a sort of, the same old Reaganite conservatism, if you will, or fusionism, as the three-legged stool, if you will. So yeah, I think this is going to be a great discussion. So we'll start out talking about. Let's focus in particularly on Kamala Harris, and then let's go into Walz. So what do you have, Alex, on Kamala Harris?
Now, with her, I was not just looking at her career and how she kind of carries herself like an aristocrat. You watch these videos they put online, and she wants to be this left-wing person, but you have kind of a whole crew that takes care of her hair. You have a makeup crew. You have people setting up the lights, and like it's a Hollywood set. There's professionals who set up the cameras and pick the right lenses to make her look as good as possible. Everything seems ritualized. When there's a rally, when there's any public appearance, when there's a public appearance of Kamala, it's like something you would expect with a European princess, or in medieval times, somebody who was governing a certain region, right? Because they had to be in public all the time, and it was very ritualized, it was very stylized. It just reminds us in Europe of the past. Now, of course, Americans are sort of forgotten about that whole crazy European history, right? So it's like American politics that they have a different understanding of what politics should be, and they celebrate American independence. But what did America become independent of? These old, weird European ways. So I look at Kamala and I see this aristocratic type person, and that's a trend I think that extends to Joe Biden as well, because Biden and his whole family, they're all tied to the mighty, powerful DuPont clan. And people have noticed in Delaware, the DuPonts, they rule this place like an aristocratic family. There's one really good book on the DuPont family. It's very critical. And they had a couple of years ago like 1,600 living members. So because they intermarry, they intermarry in their own family circles, and so this is kind of the way Europeans had done that. And this is the strain that's I think pretty strong with Kamala Harris. Her family, her parents, they met in a radical organization, and both her parents came from former British colonies, right? And this was kind of the talk at the time in the 60s when Kamala's parents met. We hate this exploitation by these white Europeans in Jamaica or in the colony of India. It was horrible. We need something new. We need something better. But you can't really have this world system. You can't really have change and have that power with a bunch of ragtag activists. That just doesn't work. You need more than that. And this is how the Democrats especially, they made their peace with having these sugar daddies and sugar mommies from large industries and the banks. They will gladly accept that money, and they try to at least achieve something. If they can have a ragtag people's communist revolution, if they can have that, they at least want to settle for a specific set of goals. If they can have it all, they actually get some kind of halfway goal. And I think that's pretty strong with Kamala. When she was 12, she moved to Canada, and she spent her teenage years and early adulthood in Canada, which is also a British system. The monarchy is kind of the British monarchy. So really the head of state of Canada is King Charles, right? It's a very traditional European kind of system, and a lot of Canadians, or even some Canadians that I personally met, they think they're better than Americans. But Canada is stuck in this European mentality. It's kind of this part French, part English kind of system, and it's very old, and it has so many bad aspects that we thought these aspects were gone with the Enlightenment, but they're still here. They're really still here. So it's kind of this grooming process, a multi-generational grooming process. Kamala's grandfather, this P.V. Gopalan, he worked for the British colonial administration. Kind of very conservative guy, apparently. He had no single rebellious bone in his body. He served the British Empire, running things over there, or co-running things over there, and then his daughter, which then became the mother of Kamala, she became a scientist, and she had a wild phase at college, but then she became a very well-adjusted scientist serving the scientific community, which is very old school, and it's very strict and very elitist. And then in the third generation, we have Kamala, spends her youth, her formative years in Canada in a European-style system, then comes back to America, and she goes through all these factories of creating new administrators, and then she becomes like this big state attorney in California. It's like multi-generational vetting, serving the system, and it's like either the whole socialism thing or the whole left-wing thing is a complete scam run by some very tough elites, or these left-wing guys, these left-wing people, they've chosen to just copy structures of the elites of the past and just say, well, we can't do what the communists did in Russia, a backward system, overthrowing it, have a people's revolution, then install a tyranny, a total dictatorship. If we can't have that, we'll just copy the stuff of the right wing or of the aristocracy and use their tricks, multi-generational vetting, all that kind of stuff. So it's either left wing is a scam run by same old elites, or the left wing has copied these old elites. So this is what I think of Kamala. Your microphone seems to be off.
Oh, sorry about that. Sorry about that. Yeah, no, Kamala is an interesting case study of democratic politics as a whole, and so is the California Democratic Party, at least as far as I analyze things. The Democratic Party took, in my opinion, a wrong turn starting in the early 1970s when you had the McGovern-Fraser Commission that pushed out a lot of the old blue collar, socially conservative in many ways, but also good on civil rights issues for blacks and other non-white Americans. The old AFL-CIO base of the party, they pushed them out as basically being very reactionary, very much American nationalists, too anti-communist, and you had the new left moving into the party. And combined with the new left, there was also this new politics crowd too, as well, which de-emphasized really the labor part in the labor component, I should say, in the Democratic Party coalition. And they were kind of de-emphasized over time. And that's when, incidentally, not only did you have the new left component, and as well as bringing in the Communist Party USA infiltration of the Democratic Party, but you also had the this sort of new capitalist, technocratic, post-industrial strand of democratic politics coming to the fore. And that's kind of the roots of the Clinton, Obama, Biden type of Democratic coalition. You have, just like with the Republicans, you have the fire industries, the finance, insurance, and real estate industries, the post industrial, more globally oriented or globalist oriented elements of capitalism moving into the party. And that's what you have basically today. And California is a perfect exemplification of this. You have the hard left of folks like Congresswoman Barbara Lee, for example, or Congresswoman Judy Chu. And they are your hard left. Barbara Lee used to work for former Congressman Ron Dellums, who never met a communist or anti-American dictatorship or movement that he didn't like. One of the last projects he engaged in was serving as a lobbyist ultimately for Putin's Russia before he passed away. And Barbara Lee worked for him. Barbara Lee is now congressman in former Congressman Ron Dellum's district in, I believe it's Oakland, the Oakland Berkeley area. You have Judy Chu, who is staunchly pro-Chinese Communist Party on so many fronts, and Trevor Loudon has done some amazing research on her. But then you also have Kamala Harris. Now, Kamala Harris is from San Francisco. She is from the Bay Area, clearly. She cut her teeth with left-wing politics and left-wing politicians, ones that are very left-wing, like Willie Brown, for example. And he is the furthest thing from a right-winger. However, when we look at her record, even when she made her initial run as president and currently as president, she represents the California coastal elite, stereotypically. She is very much, at least partially, open borders. She is definitely firmly in the woke left camp. And this is coming from someone like me who on social issues is either tends to be very dead center or a little center left or center right, depending on the issue. Just to full disclosure to the audience, if anybody accuses me of being intolerant or prejudiced, I am most assuredly not. But when you look at her record, she is firmly in the woke left camp. She is, by our standards, open borders or too liberal on issues related to immigration. One thing which the Trump administration should be all over, and if it was in 2016, certainly Donald Trump would be all over this. When she was in the Senate, when she was in the Senate, she was the lead Democratic sponsor for the Fairness for High-Skilled Immigrants Act. And this legislation would have allowed up to 140,000 H-1B visa holders to get green cards while working as inexpensive employees for American corporations. And that's what functionally the H-1B visa system It wasn't supposed to be for that, but what many companies do is they import the H-1B visa workers, they fire the American workers, including in white collar industries, and then they replace them with exploitable immigrant workforce, which is wrong. For, of course, as an American civic nationalist, it's wrong from that viewpoint, from the issue of our workforce and our standard of living, as well as also exploiting immigrants who are vulnerable too. You know, I have loads of information here where Wall Street and Silicon Valley, they were thrilled that Biden chose Kamala Harris as a vice presidential pick. Like for example, you have Blair Efron, the co-founder of Centerview Partners, texted "great choice" to CNBC on Kamala Harris's VP. Financial advisory firm Signum Global praised Harris as an alleged moderate as opposed to being a progressive populist. This is some notes I'm reading. John Hens, a partner at corporate restructuring firm Kirkland and Ellis, who was Harris's national vice chairman. So a lot of her people, even as president, are coming from major corporations, including ones that are not pro-labor by any
Yeah.
stretch. But anyway, so John Hens of Kirkland and Ellis, and when you see corporate restructuring, I see a red flag there. Corporate restructuring means basically firing and laying off people, not because of their experience or their work quality, but it's having the shareholders and majority shareholders saving money and boosting stock price in the short term. So, anyways, Hens, who was Harris's national finance chairperson, he said on CNBC, Vice President Biden's first decision is the perfect one and demonstrates his excellent judgment. Kamala's supporters will follow her lead and work nonstop to help Biden and Harris win this historical and critical election. And now, according to a New York Times op-ed piece by Matt Stoller, who's very good on corporate issues, he's also very anti-Chinese Communist Party, by the way, and he's a bit of an economic nationalist too, Matt Stoller. He mentions that Kamala Harris, now running for president, her closest advisor is her brother-in-law, Tony West, who is the chief legal officer of Uber. And when he was a top Justice Department official in Obama, he took a leading role in the flawed response to the financial crisis, too, as well, back in 2008, 2009. So he was bringing him on. He was bringing also another key supporter is the billionaire LinkedIn co-founder Reid Hoffman, who seems to believe that Wall Street and big business are what makes America great. Well, of course, indeed, he co-wrote a book called Blitzscaling that endorses the business strategy of raising a lot of money from investors in the market. And there are other forces that he has brought in from businesses like not only Uber, but Binance, David Plouffe, who worked for Uber and advised TikTok, and the cryptocurrency exchange Binance, who's also joined the team of Kamala Harris. So as I'm reading these notes, she's not the progressive populist, and certainly, in my opinion, is not a communist. So when you look at her, yes, her record, and Trevor Loudon does a good job. She cut her teeth with left-wing politicians, but her record is very mixed at best. When you take a look at foreign policy, she did reject the impositions of tariffs on dumped Chinese goods. She argued that it would falsely, by the way, raise consumer prices and injure California-based businesses. She also is for the JCPOA Iran deal, which is one of the many bad foreign policy decisions made by the Obama administration, because Iran behind the scenes continued to work on a nuclear weapons program and continued their anti-American activities worldwide, including in the Middle East. She is for the restoration of that. At least on the surface, she has condemned Venezuela's communist dictatorship. She has condemned China and North Korea and whatnot. But again, like Biden, she's very schizophrenic on foreign policy. she'll say the right things on certain issues like Russia, Ukraine, like North Korea, like Venezuela. But on the other hand, she does the two step. She'll cancel some of her good points, at least what she states, by supporting, for example, the restoration of the JCPOA Iran deal, which was supposed to ostensibly stop Iran's nuclear program. And then also, again, when China is conducting economic warfare against the American workforce and the patriotic element of the industrial elite, and there are many patriotic business people in this country, I have
And
to
isn't this
underscore
kind of
that fact.
this mega global entanglement, right? So it's like,
Yeah,
if you trade with China, you are incredibly entangled. If you do the climate change policies, against traditional cars and whatever, you create this global entanglement because you rely on China for the batteries for the cars, and also on the right wing front. When you have like the DuPont family, I mean, even in the Cold War, or even now, you think even before the Cold War, it was the DuPont family who sold chemical processes and I think even chemical plants to the Soviet Union. And we saw some other
they did.
seemingly right wing, elitist corporations selling a ton of stuff to the
Yes.
Soviets. So Ford and GM and ball bearing companies and steel companies and all kinds of stuff. So what's really going on here? It's like if you create as much entanglement as possible, you can give it a left-wing cover, you can give it a right-wing cover, but the end result will be some kind of a global system, and that
Yes.
means you cannot escape it. You can never ever escape it. And when I look at some of these names that you just mentioned, like these companies like Uber and LinkedIn and whatnots. It's like some of they're not even really profitable. They have a huge volume, but they're burning investor money, creating more entanglement because once you dominate a certain market, let's say like Netflix or Google, you can have all this investor money coming in, you destroy all competition for the next 10 years, then you hope you're making a profit. But even if you're not making a profit, you now have corporations that are too big to fail. There are systemic corporations, or like Amazon. I mean, Amazon destroyed the retail market, but they don't really make much money with retail. They make their money with these computer servers. So you always need Amazon because now even the security, I think even the American intelligence community is moving everything to the Amazon cloud system, and I think the other option was to use Microsoft. So like it's this incredible entanglement, and you can make it look like a left-wing policy, you can make it look like a right-wing policy, but there's like no escaping the system. When you have many families, stable families, and you have time for your children, you have time for your partner, these families become clever, and then they can join a smaller company or a mid-sized company, and they can outperform the large companies. They can make things better. They can make things quicker. And this is something that is being systematically suppressed, right? This is something that the elite left and the elite right, they don't want that. And they're driving down birth rates as well. And by what you mentioned, by just having these cheaper workers come in, they see that as an opportunity, but then they have to work too many hours. They can't raise their own children. So these children, they're basically starting at zero. They don't understand the world. The parents can't really teach them anything. They go through this normal school system. So these people never become true competition to these elites. So you look at Kamala Harris, the multi-generational, serving the system and everything. Or you look at some of these right-wing structures, multiple generations. These people are professionals, but they want to prevent anybody else from playing the game. They want to prevent everybody else from becoming a true player. They will pick the talents. They will find these super smart kids in school and put them in special programs and make them work for the system. But they don't want a larger number of regular people to become players and really play that game. So it's like you're not supposed to become a DuPont. You're not supposed to become these other dynasties. And it's like the DuPont dynasty, they went on for several generations, but note that they kind of had to sell the majority stakes in their own family business, and then they used that money to buy little stakes in other companies. So it's entanglement. They don't have much decision power left, but they're still in the game. So it's like the system secures itself by creating more entanglement. So even the DuPonts can't really change anything by their own will. They just follow along the system because they own 6% of that company and they own 10% of that company and a little bit of this and a little bit of that. So it's like, this is kind of what we're dealing with here. It's like even the left cannot escape these traditional ways. And I've looked at this Tim Walz guy. And I found two things about Mr. Walz. A, he's coming out of a virtual factory for politicians. This used to be called the Wellstone Action System. They find these people, they train these people, especially train them to appear like your buddy, like so that people think you're cool and you're likable. It's a very professional machine, and also the foundation of Tim Walz's ideas, especially when it comes to migration and in China and everything, this foundation comes from an economist called Kremer. And this Kremer is all about creating a world system. He calls this a world distribution system, and he promises everybody will have a decent way of living, but that's just not what reality is. And I noticed something in his state. In his state, Walz basically ruined the school system. Reading is down, math is down. A lot of students do not really go to school. They become unemployable, or they will never really make much money to begin with. Everybody becomes dumber. And then this democratic machine that they built, kind of like the Wellstone machine, they teach their own people that the population is so dumb, you have to talk to them like they're children. You shouldn't really explain your program because, these people don't understand it anyways. They like you when you trigger their gut feelings. So it's kind of this downward spiral. You win elections that way. They call it the Wellstone way. You win elections with this dumb program. Then you make people more dumb when you're in office, and then it starts over. You talk to them like they're children because they can't really understand anything. That's more complex. So this this was in 1989, Walz took a year-long teaching position with an organization called World Teach. And they're active in China and Africa and other places. And World Teach comes from Harvard circles, notably star economist Michael Kremer. Seems to be a very important link. This Kremer program is a weird blend of trade with horrible nations such as China, medical improvements for poor population segments worldwide. Tons of migration and creating this world system. And there's a paper from Kremer called Economic Transformation, Population Growth, and in the Long Run, World Income Distribution from 2006 and revised in 2008. And he always talks about these tremendous opportunities, and they are obsessed with birth rates. So they don't say it explicitly, but they want to lower the birth rates in these lesser developed countries, places like China as well. But they also want to keep the reproduction rate as low as possible in the West, so then migration becomes a necessity to keep everything from collapsing. And this creates this entanglement, and they hope they get this world system out of it. And as long as they keep the birth rates low, they can go in that direction. But if people had a lot more babies and figure out the game, they can get their system. They can get this kind of agenda really implemented. And so then, in 2005, Walz was completing this program at Camp Wellstone, program of Wellstone Action. And there's this stupid book that I just wanted to mention real briefly. This book by Jeff Blodgett, who's a 30-year veteran of Minnesota politics. And this Blodgett book is called Winning Your Election the Wellstone Way. And it's all about the people are stupid. They don't understand anything. You just capture them with these dumb slogans. And every time you watch a Walz rally, it's like this concert. So Walz is saying these simple things, and everybody goes, yay, and then they shut up, like on cue. Then he says 2-3 more things, and they all go, yay, again, and then they shut up. It's like this ritualistic style of a rally, and that's how they win elections. They've kind of created this machine, and they copied a lot from the right wing. They even admit that. They copy a lot from the right wing, and they say, we stole our ideas from the right wing. All these professionals that we work with, they're all married to each other, and we have these sugar daddies and sugar mommies from big industry, like you mentioned, these big corporation people. So isn't this like a multi-generational approach, kind of like these champagne Bolsheviks? It's this own caste of people all married to each other, and they get the big money from the big corporations. They copy the right wing, and they copy kind of the old European system, and the voters don't even realize that. They just think that, oh, Kamala looks good. Oh, Walz looks good, right? That's what they're saying.
Yeah, very interesting point, and that's some excellent research that I was not aware of regarding that. And it kind of makes sense with Tim Walz. And Tim Walz, I have mixed opinions on. You're gonna have to give me a little time to kind of unpack this here. Tim Walz, you know, regarding his China positions, it's deeply contradictory. On the one hand, he talks about China being, this his time in China, and he formed this travel company too as well. And I have concerns about that, and I'm all for, let's say, creating good relations with peoples and whatnot. But part of the problem with it is that he said, I'm trying to find the adversarial. He said that the relationship with China doesn't necessarily have to be adversarial. He said here, and the Trump administration in the beginning, the Trump campaign, excuse me, in the beginning, when Tim Walz was announced as the vice presidential candidate, the Trump administration started to somewhat attack him on this, but then kind of tapered off. Where Walz says that in 2016, I don't fall into the category that China necessarily needs to be adversarial relationship. I totally disagree. And that part of the problem with that is that it's not the United States that has really any role in making that relationship adversarial. It's the Chinese Communist Party seeking to overtake and overthrow the United States. Now, Walz says that. Walz also formed, as I said, a travel company that does a lot of, I believe, student exchanges with China. I think that's something that he needs to be questioned onto as well. Not, I'm saying in a rude way, but like, do you realize that could be used as an espionage front? What are the details about your business deals? Just like if you ask any other candidate that has a business, and there's the possibility of profiting from an enemy country that's a serial abuser of human rights, that should be questioned. So those are two areas of concern on the China issue. But to Walz's credit, he has also voted on a whole slew of human rights resolutions on behalf of Chinese dissidents, on behalf of the Tibetan human rights genocide. that occurs and has been occurring since the 1950 when the PLA, Chinese People's Liberation Army, entered and conquered Tibet. So on a lot of those issues, he's even joined with Republicans, if I recall correctly, on really holding China, at least on paper, accountable on their massive human rights violations, even when the PRC and their Hong Kong puppet government suppressed the Hong Kong pro-democracy demonstrators from a couple of years ago. So all of that part is good. But again, he contradicts himself. Here's another point that I just came across. He also opposed tariffs on dumped Chinese goods. And he opposes Donald Trump's so-called trade war, as he put it, with
Yeah.
China. And part of the problem is, and this is a problem both with the right and as well as more your corporate Democrats, is they vote on all these resolutions which calls out China on their massive human rights violations, but there has to be a strategy of decoupling, and that's where I think I am concerned that Walz does not fully understand that. On other foreign policy issues, he is very pro-Ukraine. He takes a very strong stand against the Russians. He took certainly a stand against Hamas's aggression back on October 7th against the Israelis, but he also calls for the two-state solution and a ceasefire. And I do have some questions and concerns about that. He also calls for the restoration of the Obama-era Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, which, of course, you never make any arms control agreements with untrustworthy governments like Iran, like Russia, etc. So I have concerns about that. I have concerns about also him being from a farm state. A lot of the farm states, they are very trade-oriented and very export-oriented. He wants to not only lift the already porous embargo on Cuba, but he also wants to restore or actually implement credit deals with Cuba. Now, why is that a problem? Now, currently, Cuba has to pay cash, US dollars or other hard currencies for American farm imports, agricultural imports, and they've been doing that since the year 2000. And what happens with credit is Cuba can put it on, if Tim Walz has his way, Cuba then can import food products not having to pay hard currency, but instead they just put it on basically a credit card and pay credit and put it on credit. Now, why is that a problem? Well, because Cuba has taken out loans from banks in Western Europe and Japan and the Arab world, including Arab allies like Gaddafi's Libya, and they never paid them back. They never paid them back. The Cuban National Bank, even though they had plenty of money even back then in the 1970s and into the early 80s, they never pay them back. Cuba was a horrible credit risk in that respect. So, Fidel Castro, according to a defector, Jose Lilovia Menendez, who worked very high up in the economics bureaucracy, he recalled Castro saying personally at a closed speech, take all the credit the West will give you. Just take it. Take all the credit they want. They're going to give you. Just take it. With the idea that they're not going to get paid back. And so that's my concerns with Walz. Now, the family issues on the economic issues, I will say that it certainly steps in the right direction. For example, he has taken stands against in favor of stronger labor standards. He, as governor, he helped block the merger of healthcare entities. And when companies engage in mergers and acquisitions, usually what happens was under the guise of making them efficient, they usually lay off people, and the quality of service more often than not will plummet. And then you also have the monopolization of healthcare companies. And that's a result of deregulation that started basically under the Reagan administration. And basically up until Lena Khan in the Biden administration, one of the few good people in the Biden administration and the bane of Wall Street, she has actually recently blocked several mergers, in fact, in healthcare, as a matter of fact. Walz has also capped insulin prices and also banned non compete agreements. Now, why is non compete agreements so significant? Because they basically, an employee, as a condition of employment, basically what happens is you sign this non compete, you can't leave your job essentially. Originally, non competes were put to protect company secrets and things of that nature, but it has been used and abused by corporations. Also, Governor Walz on the family values issues, what's interesting is that he did sign a bill, whether we agree with it or not, providing paid family and medical leave for Minnesotans into law. And I found that interesting. And you had mentioned the family. And one of the biggest issues for child rearing that is arresting the birth rate. And this is where conservatives, so called conservatives, and I, other than a few people like Sarab Amari and other so called national conservatives, where I agree with, but most of the conservatives, so called conservatives like the Ben Shapiro's and the Mark Levin's, that type of conservatives will wholeheartedly disagree with me on this. But one of the things that is really suppressing the birth rate is actually the costs of goods and services, and the falling wages has not improved here in the United States. According to the CDC, younger people are deciding to have less or no kids due to high health insurance costs, the search for childcare, and the lack of paid parental leave. A survey conducted by the New York Times revealed that finance is one of the top reasons why millennials are not having kids or fewer kids than they would desire. The survey polled 1,858 men and women ages 20 to 45. It found that 64% of those surveyed said childcare is too expensive, 44% said they cannot afford to have more children, and 43% said they waited to have kids because of financial
Yeah.
instability. And then I'll close off with this, and you can comment. This is from, by the way, Axios, Business Insider, and the New York Times, all three publications. As Hillary Hoffauer wrote, shelling out money for children is even harder when spending money on other increased costs. Millennials, the generation at prime childbearing age, are already struggling financially from the ongoing fallout of the recession, increasing student loan debt, and rising living costs like rent and housing. More women in their 30s, excuse me, it's a little early in the morning here, are having babies as opposed to those in their 20s. Now, one last point, and I'm going to read from some screenshots that I was looking at, where the Republicans are now going hardcore on, and you kind of insinuated this when you talk about the lack of social mobility, the people being shut out to becoming the DuPonts and really pulling themselves up by their bootstraps. But part of the problem is people without resources, you're not going to have the straps or the boots to pull themselves up. And that's the problem. And that's why I have my economic views precisely to increase social mobility. And and they're attacking Walz in all the wrong ways. Like I was giving legitimate, strong criticisms where Walz is totally wrong on issues and needs to be asked these hard questions. But yet, you have one fellow, the head of Geiger Capital. He says Tim Walz, age 60, has zero investments, no stocks, no bonds, no crypto, no real estate, no index funds, no mutual funds, no private equities, no retirement accounts. The potential VP is financially illiterate. And this was retweeted, this tweet, that obnoxious tweet, was retweeted by Ben Shapiro, where he says this would explain the socialism. And this is the problem I have with conservatives. It's this elitist, false
Yeah.
money aristocratic. So I'm liking Tim Walz because Tim Walz, for me, average Joe voter, I'm putting my saying it hypothetically, it's like here are these sort of plutocratic minded so-called conservatives like Shapiro, this Geiger Capital, which is no doubt probably private equity or whatnot, slash and burn type of capitalism. And here they're sounding so out of touch. They're coming
Hmm.
to totally laying their innermost thoughts bare, basically saying, look, we have money, we're rich, we're automatically better than you, average Joe American. Well, Tim Walz, well, because most Americans don't have stocks. Only 10%, I think, of Americans have stocks. Tim Walz is basically one of us, one of the average Americans who doesn't have stocks, bonds, real estate, can't afford, multiple homes and things of that nature and whatnot. So, this is in the conservatives, the Trumpet campaign. This is, and his supporters are just like going full scale
Yeah.
social Darwinist plutocratic.
I think
And
it's
I have
yeah.
a problem with that.
There's a left wing way and there's a right wing way to destroy the demographics and to destroy uh, the quota of people having babies or how many babies they have. So if you just blindly follow these right wing elites, then as you said, you can't really afford children, and if you try it, it's such a horrible experience that it destroys kind of the family dynamic. You're always working, and both parents are working, and you barely see your children at all. And by the time your children turn about 11, then it's when puberty kicks in, and children, especially, find their parents to be cringeworthy or strange, and they see all your flaws, and the children then understand even the flaws of the parents' relationship. When all you do is work, and then you have to take care of children. There's no more time for partnership with the parents, and so at
Right.
some point the children will realize that and say, this is not a real marriage. This is kind of like a fake partnership. This is almost like a job that they have. The parents are colleagues, they're work colleagues. And so this is kind of the experience that the children then have. So they don't understand what a family can be or what a family should be. So what is this children generation gonna do later when they have some sort of ability to have families themselves? I mean, if you don't have a positive experience, and if you see other families, these kids talk to other kids, and then they hear about divorces and they hear about all this nasty stuff that's going on, all these problems, and every marriage is bad or every marriage is poor.
Mhm.
This children generation will probably not have children themselves later, or maybe just one child. And if you blindly follow these left-wing elites, if you follow these left-wing networks, you may be able to afford children, but they're not your children then, because
Yes.
you don't see them. You get some time off, and you don't have to worry that much about paying the bills. You have a roof over your house, but they're not your
Yes.
children. If somebody else is raising them, and by the time they're 11 or 12, they think the parents are kind of stupid anyway, and the system, they kind of hate the system, and they become kind of rebellious. Are these children going to have children later on? So it's nice to have some, to get some improvements and some goodies by Mr. Walz. But overall, I think this current children generation, they may not be interested in having children themselves later on, because they've had this experience, not a real family experience. There's no real loyalty among peasants, right? Because it's all about pragmatism. Every day is about pragmatism. Parents are yelling at their children because the children, they have to take out the trash, do their schoolwork, behave, don't smoke, don't drink, don't do anything stupid. It's like a job. It's like a family becomes like a workplace. And so
Yeah.
in a more conservative family, the children are being indoctrinated. You have to work like a machine. You have to function like a robot, and maybe you're gonna have something one day. So you're gonna work your butt off, and maybe it's gonna work out for you. So this is kind of what they're hearing. And with these left-wing families, when there's not so much pressure anymore of paying rent and paying for food, and having kind of a long-term safety. If the pressure is lowered, with these left-wing families, because of all this ideological stuff, then you get these problems that you're already seeing in Walz's state, where these children don't go to school. There's like 30% of children there. They don't really attend school that much. They skip school all the time. So they become unemployable. They really become unemployable. And it's like, how do you create a family when you're unemployable? Or all you can get is these low-paying jobs, and then they give you some goodies again. They will raise the minimum wage, and they will have some sort of a public housing project, so you can live in your little dinky apartment, and they're gonna make it out of cardboard next, or some trash next. And yeah, you're gonna have a roof over your head, but it's gonna be just a miserable life, and all you can expect out of it is legal cannabis and watching Netflix. And it's like, you can grow cannabis for next to nothing, and a Netflix subscription costs next to nothing. That's not a life. So you either cannot afford children, or you cannot afford a real family dynamic. Or you can afford children, but they're not your children. So this is kind of the left-wing way of destroying the birth rate, and there's a right-wing way of destroying the birth rate. And you mentioned Ben Shapiro. Now, Shapiro is a very rich man. He's a very rich man. Tucker Carlson is a very rich man. I don't know if Carlson has children, but in general, these guys, they can afford the nannies. They can afford multiple cars. They don't have to worry if their car breaks down. They can just
they can afford their children's education.
Exactly.
So there's not to interrupt.
Private teachers,
afford a lot of these things.
Private teachers, private schools. They keep their children away from all the big trouble, and there's no worries about student loans. There's no worries about what's going to happen next. And if you are wired into these more wealthy circles, they keep among themselves. So your children are playing with other privileged children. So it's all kind of this thing that's even it's very well described by Professor Carroll Quigley in his book Tragedy and Hope. At the end of the book, you have to skip like the first 800 to 900 pages. He makes this comparison. He says that the worst thing you could have is like a backwards medieval family dynamic. And he says that, unfortunately in the Muslim world, it's oftentimes very, very traditional, very backwards, arranged marriages, and these young boys, they get to do, they're allowed anything. So he says that's kind of the worst way you could do this. And even some right-wingers today, these Christian right-wingers, extreme right-wingers, they're basically saying we should have an very old style system, pre-American style system, kind of a European style system. That does not work. So Quigley says that's the worst thing you could have. Then he says the next step in family relations and all that, the next step would be these social climbers, these average people out there, these normies. They work jobs and they want to put their children into college, and sometimes they perform really well. And Quigley says that these people are usually a bit weird. So they can be financially somewhat successful, but they're just doing it for themselves. They don't have an understanding of being in a group. So they still have kind of a peasant mindset. They're privileged peasants. And then he says the best way of doing it is kind of how the old aristocracy was doing it among themselves. Because they don't need traditional feminism. They don't need traditional patriarchy like the commoners. No, they created this aristocratic system where they're all part of a group, and they function for the group, and they try to be happy with each other. They try to really like each other, and they have he says they have a sense of humor, and they get along with each other, and they raise their children to be mindful of the collective. This is the key difference that Quigley describes in his book. He says that in the upper classes, these children understand they're part of the upper class, and they understand there's a work ethic they need to have, and there's a sense of collaboration that they need to have. If you don't have that type of collaboration, you will possibly be excluded from these circles. And so this is like, when you have, what was it, a couple of years ago, 1,600 living DuPonts. I mean, talk about a family like DuPont having these many children, and then look at the average normal family with one child or two children, or maybe struggling with three children. It's a completely different kind of way of handling these things. And it's like for both the left and the right, they're just sabotaging these people out there, sabotaging the families. And sometimes you get some goodies. You know, the left will give you some goodies, but it's not going to work out in the long run. And sometimes the right will give you some goodies. They will, for example, they have like a certain boom phase. So when the big banks and the big hedge funds, they reinvest some of the money they acquired in different ways, with insider trading and that sort of stuff, they put some of that money back into the system and create a slight boom phase. So now you have more jobs and maybe some better wages, and they give you a bunch of goodies, right? So people are content, the voters are a bit more happy, but you're still trapped in this hamster wheel. You're still trapped in this race. You have to work your ass off. Your children have to be hyper disciplined, because one mistake and it all falls apart. If you're a normie, there's no safety net. One bad lawsuit, one bad
Right.
divorce, one child that goes bad, as a teenager doing drugs, alcohol, mental illness, one mistake and it all falls apart because you don't have that safety net. So this is like,
Yeah. You basically encapsulate my concerns too as well. I think what you state is right on the money. Before I go into the two Pincer attack on the American family, and I'm going to cover the left wing and the communist pincer in this attack, is my ideal here in America was the economic arrangements that existed before Reagan and Clinton and others really upended it, because they didn't agree with the New Deal as well as the American School of Economics of Abraham Lincoln and Hamilton and George Washington. Uh, my ideal is to have strong non communist unions to negotiate different contracts based on whether a company is doing well or not, and securing a standard of living of workers where they can afford for the families and whatnot. Actually, in many areas, though not entirely, at least in principle, I don't agree with the welfare state. That's why, in place of the welfare state, you need to have strong unions. Why? So people are making their own money and earning their way, but they're doing it in a fair way too, as well, not relying on the good graces of the almighty business person to give you a high wage or a low wage, because workers and employees are not necessarily paid what they're worth. That's really not how it works all the time. Many businesses, yes, it works that way to recruit and retain talent, but other ways, and other businesses, especially the large multinational corporations, other publicly traded companies, it's more like how much can we pay how little can we get away with not paying the workers well and giving them the best benefits so we can boost the stock prices for our majority shareholders and whatnot. Because we're taught in economics classes, and I've taken Econ 101, Econ 101 and 102, and in many ways it's the most counterintuitive BS you'll ever be
yeah,
fed. I took it at Florida Atlantic University, especially when it's given this classical liberal economics thrust, this ultra free market, so to speak. And I agree with free markets to many ways, but they teach you a variety of things. I'm not going to get into it now, that are very counterintuitive. So you look at that, and this is why I'm for, in a nutshell, strong unions, strong controls and laws against obviously predatory forms of finance like stock buybacks, like private equity, like leverage buyouts, which is basically what private equity is, and things of that nature, to restore what I would argue the stability in capitalism and the credibility. And you have to balance that. You have to balance strong unions, certain welfare state provisions, particularly with public, for certain majors, free public college and university tuitions for certain majors, ones that are of the hard sciences, as well as teaching, and trade schools and whatnot. You have to marry that with a culture of individual responsibility and accountability at an individual level. And you have to blend those two forces. And we were on the right track here in the United States from the 1930s, 1940s, well into the 1970s. In the 1970s, when the United States started to suffer from inflation and then stagflation, that opened the door for the Milton Friedmans and the others, who we all might agree with on the general outlines of the importance of free enterprise and private property. The reality is they didn't like that arrangement and all. They did not believe in that small d democratic capitalism, democratically managed workplaces where labor and management were, at least in theory, co equals, if you will, where unions were stronger, where we had a level of protectionism. They didn't agree with it. They did not agree with the concept of the social mobility, if you will. They had more of a social Darwinist view of society, if you will, and a very sort of plutocratic view of society and social actors, that the rich were gods and they were job creators, and the workers should be thankful for the almighty rich person for giving them a job. It has a little whiff of almost a little bit of a feudalistic tendency, to put it very crudely. I may even be misdefining. Now, the communists, they looked at this post-World War II consensus here in the United States. They viewed it as a threat. Now, Theodore Adorno, who I'm sure the audience know who he was. He's a neo-Marxist, and he was the author of the concept of the authoritarian personality. He commented that the American working class's, quote, standard of living in comparison with the English conditions of 100 years ago, which the authors of the Communist Manifesto had before them, has not become worse, but has improved. Shorter working hours, better nutrition, housing and clothing, protection of family members and the aged, and a higher average life expectancy have, along with the development of the technical productive forces, all accrued to the workers. There can no longer be any talk of hunger necessarily bringing them together and driving the revolution. So where did they go? They used cultural Marxism. And I know I'm going to upset the left-wing viewers of my program for saying this, but it's reality. They decided, in the CPUSA, they revised their program in their 1959 meeting. They had a big meeting, a big Congress, where they decided they're going to go into and use feminism and civil rights against the United States. They're going to use those as wedge issues. Now, it really is true that the early Bolsheviks, for opportunistic reasons, were using trying to break down what we would view as the traditional family in order to overthrow capitalism. When Alexandra Kollontai, who was the Soviet People's Commissar for Social Welfare and the founder of the Women's Department of the Bolshevik regime, wrote in 1921, "Only a code of sexual morality that is in harmony with the problems of the working class can serve as an important weapon in strengthening the working class's fighting position." And Kollontai believed that the rejection of the element of submission in marriage and the greater fluidity in relationships between the sexes are key components. These are mostly her words, are key components in the struggle to bring down what she derided as, quote, the bourgeois family. And her line of argumentation is once the bourgeois family was dissolved, capitalism would be eradicated. So you have these American feminists, and I think you bring up a great point, Alex. You might have a lot of good economic reforms that are family friendly, but if you have a culture, and particularly if you take a women's studies class, for example, or even certain history classes, you're fed a diet, and I am a moderate feminist, but you have the radical feminists, and some of whom actually had ties to the Communist Party USA. You have, for example, American feminist Betty Friedan, which, I mean, I had to read her in college, and you had to read her also in high school, certainly taught her beliefs. She said, compared the housewife's life to that of, quote, a comfortable concentration camp. She claimed that the responsibilities of, quote, American suburban housewife were, quote, endless, monotonous, unrewarding. Friedan wrote how they suffered, quote, a slow death of mind and spirit. And lastly, Friedan recommended a, quote, massive attempt by educators and parents and ministers, magazine editors, manipulators, guidance counselors to halt, quote, the early marriage movement, stop girls from growing up wanting to be just a housewife. Mallory Millett, a former radical feminist and actress, recounted how at a Maoist-style, quote, consciousness-raising group, assembled feminists chanted their desire to spearhead a, quote, cultural revolution through the destruction of, quote, the American family. They believed that the, quote, American patriarch would be destroyed through taking away his power by destroying marriage. Even more sinister, because these are my notes with direct quotations from primary sources that these folks have written, even more sinister was their method of destroying monogamy, quote, by promoting promiscuity, eroticism, prostitution, and homosexuality. So LGBTQ rights activist and left-wing author Masha Gessen admitted, quote, it's a no-brainer that the institution of marriage should not exist. Fighting for gay marriage generally involves lying about what we are going to do with marriage when we get there, because we lie that the institution of marriage is not going to change, and that is a lie. The institution of marriage is going to change, and it should change, and again, I don't think it should exist. So they're just going against all forms of marriage, gay marriage, marriage of straight couples, and everything else. They want to collapse that. And look, I am on the center left on a lot of these social issues, but my reading of these primary source texts is there's a greater goal that has nothing to do with necessarily creating any kind of parental unit, whether gay or straight or whatnot. It's really the issue is the revolution. So what's happening is you have this pincer attack by this sort of Reaganomics, very supply side economics or neoliberalism, where they're very social Darwinist, survival of the fittest. The rich people are gods, and you should just do what they say, pay, accept whatever wage they give you, sit down, shut up. You know, they're better than you, like the Ben Shapiro's and Geiger Capital that I quoted. And now you have the radical so-called feminists, and you have the early Bolshevik dictatorship. You basically saying, well, no, we got to deconstruct the family. And these books are basically pushed in selected college courses too as well, without any criticisms. And really the last statement is very sinister because, again, they're going against all kinds of marriage, the whole notion of a parent-parental unit, whether they're even two moms, two dads, or a mom and a dad. So this is what the youth are being force-fed, if you will. So you're right. In the sense, you might get social benefits and social reforms that are badly needed, but if it coexists with a culture that slowly deconstructs, intellectually at least, the family, you're going to have problems. And then on the other side of the equation, you have Ben Shapiro saying, well, we got to have more kids. We got to have more kids. But by the way, you got to work 3 jobs in order to support them. You're going to have no life and no time to spend with them. So this is why I never was enamored with the far left. But the so-called right wing, that so-called conservative that conserves nothing except the private sector oligarchs' aggregated wealth and power, I no longer accept them either. Yeah. So this is why I'm politically homeless, dude.
I looked at the European past, especially Middle Ages and before that. I started to notice things I wasn't even looking for. When it comes to men and women and relationships and marriage and families, it was intimately tied to the system of peasant serfdom, right? And so, from the viewpoint of an elite, a classic empire, a rulership group, from the ruler's perspective, you're dealing with, you want to have certain groups in the population, certain categories that an empire can work with, right? So the majority of people is supposed to be kind of boring, performing their tasks, not rebelling, not be complicated, not be really creative. They're just supposed to be boring, task performers. That's kind of one of the most important categories of people that elites want. Then there's a category that always happens. This category is, I call the dysfunctional category. It's these people that cannot perform what is expected of them for a variety of reasons. So this group of people was completely useless to these elites. So this is usually why they just didn't care at all about dysfunctional people. So you had a mental illness or you had an injury, you were on your own for the most part. And medicine at the time was, of course, terrible. So elites didn't care about dysfunctional people. And then you have a group in society which I just call the evil group. These are the psychopaths, these are malignant narcissists. And this is kind of a double-edged sword for elites. You need some of them to perform some nasty tasks. Some especially in the past, the police, the police and the military was really grim, right? If you want to oppress your population and use rough techniques, you need some psychos for that. If you want to invade other countries and murder the men and steal the women and children, you need some pretty, mean psychos to do that, right? But some of these narcissists and psychopaths, they want to do their own thing and they become a problem for the elite. So that's why you have to, hunt some of them down and put them in prisons. So this is kind of like a simple, explanation of these different groups in society, right? And so this is how it was always run for millennia of traditional imperialism. And that had a profound effect on how men and women interact with each other and how they communicate and how their personalities were. Because for the guys in peasant serfdom, it was dangerous to be creative. It was dangerous to have your own opinion. It was dangerous to tell everybody what you really feel. It was dangerous to tell everybody what you really thought of things. So the best chances of success and the best chances of survival you had if you just went with the flow, appear boring. Because if you appear boring, the authorities will more or less let you be. They will let you perform your tasks and pay your taxes in the forms of the grain you produced or whatever you produce. They will let you be for the most part. So it was kind of a survival strategy for men to become boring and to become terrible at talking, communicating. So, and I think this persists to this day because the biggest problem I think that is sabotaging relationships and especially marriages and having children, the biggest problem is communication because people are still stuck in these old styles of communication. What's the number one complaint of women in relationships, especially in long-term marriages? The guys cannot communicate. They can't talk about their inner world, what they really think. They're not creative when it comes to, conversations. They're not having fun with conversations. And it's sometimes women, they choose the wrong words. They say they want vulnerability in men. No, they want men. They want men to have that capacity to understand their own mind and the minds of others, because that's actually a very, very key ability to have as a man, because you constantly have to judge other men, women. You have to know how they function, and you have to understand how your own mind functions so you don't become a victim of scams or whatever. So this is kind of this thing. We're stuck as men, usually as men, we're stuck in this old way of communicating because that's what kept us alive for the most part for millennia. Be boring. That's why men love to talk about pointless things. They talk about sports. They talk about things that don't really matter, things that don't really touch your own state of mind. And so then when we come to women, what's the most important complaint that men have about women? Again, it's related to communication. It's the problem that women tend to not communicate in a literal sense. That women usually don't want to say things exactly the way they mean it. They express things through emotions, or they talk around the issue or sideways. They don't really mean what they say, and this drives men insane. And I think this is also a very old style of communication that kept women alive for the most part for a long time. It was just the safest thing to do. You know, you don't want trouble with the government, you don't want trouble with the church, and you don't want trouble with your husband who has all the power in the household. So you need to have, you know, a bit of psychological trickery. You need to communicate sideways, not so directly, not really in a direct way. And this is driving people crazy. And so nowadays, in our societies, I think we still have a problem, massive problem, with these three attributes in the general population, men and women alike. People are either too boring, lifeless and boring, or they're dysfunctional, or they're evil. And so this is why when it comes to dating and choosing a partner, especially a partner for a marriage, you want to avoid these three things, because if your partner scores really high in one of these categories, it's horrible to be with them. You either bore yourself to death, you become just numb, you just become mind-numbingly frustrated with a partner if the partner is boring. If the partner is dysfunctional, it's a bunch of trouble, and that you're not professionally equipped to handle, right? If somebody has, let's say, if somebody has a psychological problem, you know, this requires work and professional help and to work that out and maybe get out of it. But many people, they don't understand that. They think that their love can heal anything, but your love cannot solve everybody's psychological problems. And then there's the evil category. You cannot live with an evil man or woman. And there's narcissistic women, there's deeply narcissistic men, and there's true psychopaths. And so this is kind of this problem that we have that is keeping us from being happy with each other. You know, people are either too boring, too dysfunctional, and too evil. And if we look at history, this is what people were forced to be. The majority chose, for whatever reason, to be boring and bland, not get in trouble. Then there's some people that become dysfunctional because of all of the tyranny. And then there's some people who are genetically more inclined to evil because psychopaths have different brains oftentimes. And some people, because of all this tyranny, they decide or they become evil themselves and they become these predators and they try to copy the establishment. I mean, this became famous with the movie Clockwork Orange, based on a novel, but the movie I think was more popular by Stanley Kubrick. And maybe people remember that movie. It's this gang, the small gang of young men led by Alexander Delarge, I think was his name. And what is he doing? He's copying the aristocracy. He's copying the ruling class. He loves classical music. He loves to dress like an aristocrat, and he takes what he wants to take. He rapes people. He steals things, and he lives kind of this exuberant life, even though he's just a young guy. So this is kind of like what is sabotaging our relationships and our families, and so a ruling elite, either by using, you know, mechanisms disguised as left wing or mechanisms disguised as right wing, it's either left or right wing, you can make sure that you get more boring people, more dysfunctional people, and more evil people. Because that's kind of well understood how you get more of the same categories, right? And if you have children, I mean, I have children, and I kind of see that. I kind of see this thing where it's dangerous to be creative, it's dangerous to be different. You get a ton of problems, you get a ton of negative feedback if you're just outside of the norm. If anything's different with you, you will get attacked viciously, like you're some sort of enemy, like you're some sort of a problem. So what do these kids learn? You gotta like what everybody else likes. You gotta talk like everybody else talks. You gotta be as boring as possible. And if you become dysfunctional, which is very easy to slide into, if you become dysfunctional, you can try to mask yourself and appear like you're one of the regular boring people. You're hiding your dysfunctionality. You appear like the boring majority. Or if you're evil, you can also hide and appear either boring, like you're normal, or which is kind of a very, very problematic thing in of itself. You seem like a guy who is none of these categories, right? Like the movie heroes or like characters from a novel, because the hero characters we like in fiction, they're neither boring, they're not dysfunctional, and they're not evil. So they present themselves, especially evil people, they present themselves to be none of those characteristics, and so everybody else thinks they're the greatest thing, but eventually you find out they're evil, right?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting point you make there. Concerning relationships here in the United States, I mean, I was married from, I guess I'm going to go a little bit into my own personal life, which I generally don't like to do, but I guess it kind of, answers, the various observations you make. I was married from December of 2003. My ex-wife and I got divorced in February, March of 2019. I didn't have a huge amount of dating experience before, went on a whole bunch of dates, had maybe about three short term girlfriends. And about 5 or 6 months after my divorce, I started to date a lot. I mean, a lot more than I ever did. Um, had have a girlfriend now for 2 years, 8 months, had three girlfriends before, went on a whole bunch of dates. So definitely I made a lot of observations. I think it's when you comment about dating relationships and marriages, it's not a, one size fits all situation. I think there are many, many dynamics at work here in the United States. It depends on which region of the country you're in, whether you're in the city versus the rural areas, whether it's a large metropolis, either on the West Coast or let's say Chicago or the East Coast, versus all the rural areas in different parts of the country or small towns or small cities. It's so diverse. It depends on the culture of the partner you date. There's a huge role at times with that. One of the problems I see starting in the wake of the 1960s, and again, would call myself probably a moderate feminist in certain ways, very old school, not third wave feminism. But one of the issues, and I think it might have to do with the radical feminism, if you will, that has permeated our culture, is this notion that the woman acts like a man, that they're basically take on the road as being very bossy and very domineering. And I think that has become a feature of American marriage and American dating, a subcomponent of it. It's not the whole truth about it. But that's a growing a problem where the male is very nice. They want to be accommodating and a team player. And you kind of cede the ground to a woman who is very domineering, who thinks they're right about everything, and you can't communicate. And part of the problem with that is, people, wanting to be, I guess, too nice or inexperienced in dating things of that nature before, and settling down. People, men and women, want to settle down with a partner who seems nice, who seems has a good job, who's stable, has their stuff together, so to speak, and they want to have kids. I would argue that most people, men and women, are naturally hardwired to procreate, to develop families, to continue the bloodline. That's my personal observation, if you will, personal opinion. So I think you have the problem of the domineering female, where you had the over domineering or suffocating, quote, modern female. You have that component. It's not to say all modern females are like that. There are many that are not like that. I think there's this expectation of men too as well, that men have to be able to afford a lot of things that have become so expensive that Men have to sacrifice work-life balance. Same thing with women too, as well, in order to keep a family together. That's a huge problem to develop a family, to even have one child and whatnot. And that's a huge issue that impinges on the happiness, because I believe in life, like in politics and economics, everything has to be as balanced as much as possible. Part of the problem with American politics, American relationships to some degree, American economics, everything is so extreme. Everything is based on feelings and prejudices at times, and not enough on common sense. What do actually human beings want? And every human being is different too. We have our own stories, all of us individually, and our own life situations. I think also there is a problem. There is a challenge where you have portions of females, including men, that don't fulfill their what is considered their traditional gender roles. You have a portion of our female population, wives as well as people who are in relationships, that really lose that feminine mystique, that femininity, if you will, and that's a problem too as well. Just like there are men that are becoming sissy men that are not protective of women too. So you have that erosion on the other side of the coin. You have this. You have so many challenges with dating, and to speak from the men's point of view, we have growing numbers of men who are divorced, who are not married, who are looking to establish relationships and families. They're actually looking abroad to different countries outside of Europe, the United
Yeah.
States, and Canada to find partners, because they may be hardworking and intelligent and very ambitious. They also are very nurturing to their men too, as well, and very supportive. I mean, so far, I'm not trying to brag, but here's a positive note. I will plug in my girlfriend in this case. She is from Peru. She's a modern woman. She's strong. She's ambitious. She's an entrepreneur. I admire her in so many respects, but she's also very supportive of me. And she pushes me to do new things that I have never done before, or I was a little scared to do. But of course, my confidence level is different when I'm younger, and I'm of the opinion you got to live life and try things. If you don't like it, then you don't try it again. So I'm doing things that I normally would never do as well, and she pushes me in a way that's not obnoxious or demeaning or anything else. And that's where you have that right balance. And maybe it's her upbringing or because of her personality, but I have found from talking to different people over these X number of years since, my divorce, and even before my divorce, where more and more men, I've watched the different YouTube videos and whatnot, where people are really looking abroad outside the developed industrialized world to find partners. And I think what has to happen, and I guess this is may sound Pollyannish, but I think there needs to be not only solid communication, but that communication has to be based on mutual respect, with the idea that just because I'm the man doesn't mean I have always all the answers all the time, every day, all the time. And just because you're a woman doesn't mean that you have the answers and all the right decisions and everything else 100% of the time, 365 days in the year. And I think it has to go back, just like labor management and politics, there has to be a sort of sense of mutual cooperation and mutual respect, without treading on the other party in an extreme fashion. And that's really where I come down on the relationships. I'm not here to bash women, just say I hate women. I'm not into the incel or the black pill Andrew Tate kind of thing. I think folks like Andrew Tate and the others, they exemplify the worst element of the masculine character. And they also have this sort of social Darwinist view of capitalism. And I think social Darwinism, variant of capitalism, and you combine that with radical feminism, are both the two biggest things that have caused institutionally that have caused a lot of these challenges and problems in the American family, as well as in relationships and gender roles and whatnot. I think we have to get back to good old fashioned centrist sense of mutual respect and balance. And that's where I think the conservatives need to really go full on into it. Because again, you got to outflank your political adversaries, and you have to do it in a way where you seem welcoming to all groups of people unless you do harm by abusing
Yeah.
your
Did
power.
you notice
And
that?
that's what it comes down to.
Did you notice that when this was, I think, in the early 1980s? This is when the Council for National Policy was created, the CNP. It's a very quiet organization. I mean, there have been some leaks over the years,
Yes.
membership lists. There's like
Mm-hmm.
a fairly recent book on it. The title eludes me right now. I read it a while ago. And so this is kind of like the time when uh, these more elite connected right wingers, they were trying to project into the future what's America going to be like in 50 years. And according to the projections, in 50 years, America would be pretty much to the left. And so they created this new organization to try to counter that trend, to change the trajectory of the country. Now, what they ultimately achieved was not a conservative dominance. They could only achieve this sort of 50-50 equilibrium between the left and the right. And when you look at what these CNP people had implemented, it was a very, very primitive type of program. They bought all these radio stations, or they bought airtime, and it was the most bland, boring style of Jesus, the flag, and get married, and everybody was supposed to be the same, right? And you were not supposed to come up with something new. You were not supposed to be creative and be flexible. You were not supposed to have a sense of humor and reflect things. So it was kind of this bland and boring program. And that's how they managed at least this 50-50 equilibrium. But it was lacking. It was severely lacking in creativity. It was so boring and bland. And then, of course, when this program was implemented, you had a young generation of men and also women, a young generation that was just as bland as that program was, right? So the parents were very strict. You cannot listen to this music. You cannot watch that movie.
Right.
You cannot go out and have fun. You cannot question the church or that particular church we go to, or you cannot. You're not supposed to study this. You're not supposed to study that. You're just supposed to go to church and follow in your parents' footsteps. And become like everybody else in the community. You're going to be an adult, you're going to drink beer and watch football and go to church, and it's all going to be the same. So very restrictive type system, and it became really, really boring. And then on the left, it became partially boring and partially very dysfunctional. So with the dysfunctionality, is just when record numbers of young people, especially young women, they have mental problems. They have eating disorders, panic attacks. There's a lot of depression going on. So this is kind of like what's being cultivated, make young people dysfunctional. And also when you look at young people today, the so-called modern left, it's incredibly boring. I mean, who wants another person who likes the same things, has the same political ideas, had never had an original thought in their lives? It's dull. It's boring as heck. And if you ever want to have a family, if you ever want to settle down and have children, you need to be interesting and remain interesting to the other person. And so you constantly need to read something new, something relevant, and have something interesting to talk about, work on your communication skills, and have a sense of humor, right? You need to be able to laugh at almost anything. You need to have a sort of a distance to everything. You need to understand the flaws in everything and make fun of things, because life usually doesn't give you a lot to laugh about in general. So you gotta come up with something funny. And once you have children and you're tied to the next 18 years or sometimes more, you're tied to this family unit, there's a lot of unpaid extra work. So when the children are small, they get sick or they don't sleep at night. You can't go out somewhere. You just always gotta take care of the children. Everything is 100 times more complicated. So you need a sense of humor. If you have a strong sense of humor, you can actually have fun while having children. And if you remain interesting, or you become more interesting over the years, there's never any real boredom, or there's never really any uncanny silence between two partners. Because I'm not the same guy I was 5 years ago, and then I was not the same guy I was 5 years before that, and I was not the same guy as 5 years before that. So I become more interesting as time goes on. My communication skills improve. I can laugh about really everything. And so you got to become a bit of your own comedian. You got to become a bit of a comedian when it comes to life, because life is absurd in many ways. It's really absurd. And the systems that we live under are quite absurd. And this is how you can have a long-term relationship and be the most. Sometimes you're the most interesting person that the other person knows, and that person is the person you want to be with, because that's the most interesting person you know. Right? This is that's the only way it can work. And there's so many factors, institutionalized factors, working against you acquiring these personality traits and acquiring the skill set to improve. And this is why people are having such a hard time. And they're looking for a gimmicky answer. They're looking for a gimmick. Then you get Andrew Tate, and he basically tells you to be a guy like 500 years ago, just to be evil, basically, and not call it that.
Yes.
Or you just choose some other gimmicky thing and think that it's going to work out. I mean, these hardcore, super crazy feminists, like the very narcissistic type feminists. I mean, they're using the same styles of discrimination that men oftentimes used in the past against women. I mean, did you notice that? I mean, what would these radical feminists? What would these radical feminists say about men in general? Well, they're never really adults. They never become real adults. They always need to be told what to do. They're inherently faulty. You cannot let them make decisions on their own. They're like children, and they just have to perform their tasks like they're a household appliance. It's like when
and then we have to act like men when it's convenient for them.
Sure.
When it's well. So there's a double standard with them too. It's like we have to be a man when it serves their purposes too, with that element. And then at the other times we're supposed to roll over and play dead too as well. And again, I'm not talking about all women, but there is a subsection here, and I've seen that, and I know friends of mine that have been through relationships like that, tortured in relationships like that, frankly. And it's very, very discouraging, if you will, in that way when you look at it. I think also you make a very good point about having a sense of humor. That's one thing that I find with most women that I've dated, especially a lot since I've divorced. And I'm going to be frank with you in the audience. I think I have changed. I think I've become a lot more confident. 5 or 6 months after the divorce, I looked at myself in the mirror and I said, yes, I'm a flawed human being, but I wasn't entirely responsible for the collapse of the relationship. It takes two to tango. I'm not going to bash the other party, in an extreme fashion, but I'm not going to tear myself down. And it took about a half a year for me to realize that really quickly, and a lot of other things too. And when I look at it, and I'm not trying to brag or anything, and forgive me if I come across as a braggart, it's not my intention. My intention is to establish my credibility, actually, as a commentator on this particular issue. But with a lot of dating and relationships I've had, one thing I can tell you, a lot of women, they like a confident man that knows who they are and what their goals are. And two, they like a guy with a sense of humor. Now, I will tell you, one of the secrets that keeps me sane with our political show, my show that I do, the Politically Homeless podcast, the writing and the research I do, Have other hobbies. Be active in physical sports, fitness. I do the paddleboarding, the windsurfing, and all the rest of it. Have these activities and diversify your portfolio, if for the lack of a better term. Not only does that look attractive to women, as long as you have the resources and the time to do it, it also makes you a healthier person, both in mind and body, too, as well. It's very, very important. The other thing I find is very important, not only is mutual respect in a relationship, but having similar core goals and interests. That is so important. If you have somebody who you really don't have any common interests and common hobbies, I find that's not going to work. If you're into fitness like I am and I was when I was a lot younger, and then you time goes by, you lose it, and then you get it back. Um, if you if you're into fitness and the outdoors and you are with somebody who's a homebody who likes to hang around the house and do indoor things solely and things of that nature, that's not a good match necessarily, unless that other party is willing to say, hey, you know
Yeah.
what, I like that lifestyle, let me absorb that for my own benefit.
And I think
So
when you talk about these hot button topics in American politics, the like the abortion topic, or
mhm.
then there's some of these extreme guys, influencers, and they say there shouldn't be a legal way to divorce, right? So
Right,
they're floating
yes,
these ideas that you should never be able to divorce, or
exactly.
the laws should be changed that if a woman or if a woman gets separated from a man, she has uh, she will be absolutely completely broke, even though she may have raised 2 or 3 children. So there's like
Exactly.
these extreme ideas floating around, and usually that never works because life is complex. So you have to be mentally flexible. You have to adapt to a reality. If you're too rigid in your thinking,
Yes.
you actually create less stability instead of more stability. So, for example, with these extreme positions on abortion, one side says never ever abortion in under absolutely no circumstances, and
Yes.
the other side says,
Yes.
well, everybody just does whatever the heck they want anytime they want. Now, of course, there's very young people, very young women that may get pregnant, and it's just the
Hmm.
absolute wrong thing at the wrong time. This could completely derail not just the woman's life, but this under certain circumstances, this could become just a big problem. It's just something that if a girl is 14, if a girl is 14, 15, one time something goes wrong with contraception, it can, especially if the economy is so bad and you have to climb socially, you cannot afford any mistakes, and it's a huge problem
Yes.
if there's absolutely zero ability for abortion, and also with these divorces, if there's no option of having a divorce, or a divorce means you're broke forever, your life is destroyed.
Hmm.
How do you
Yes.
then untangle a really toxic relationship? Let's say, for example, and this is
Yes.
just one of many different examples. Let's say the man has become a total alcoholic, and he's got some severe narcissistic traits or a full-blown narcissistic disorder. You cannot fix this thing in a relationship. It's
Hmm.
unfixable. Not even professionals can fix some of these things. So there needs to be a significant way of having a separation. Because if you don't have a way, it's going to create a massive problem, not just for that family, if they all have to stay under that roof, but the long lasting damage of, let's say, the wife, or sometimes is the guy that's suffering under a crazy psycho. Sometimes the guy is the victim in this. And the children. I mean, you're going to end up with some pretty screwed up children who have it so much harder to be, functional in their lives. So
Yeah.
you got to be flexible in your thinking. And I see that these influencers from the left and the right, they're very rigid, as if you can have a
Yes.
gimmick, a simple gimmick, this absolutist way of doing things, and this is going to fix everything.
Yes.
But it's really not fixing everything. And then there's this other thing. Let's say um, a married couple the woman is maybe 40 years old. They've struggled to have 2, 3 children, raise them correctly. They're trying to pay off the mortgage. They're still paying off the house. They just overexerted themselves to make things function. And then at age 40, that woman gets pregnant again by accident, just by accident,
Yes.
because one slip up, one tiny mistake, and this could derail this entire family structure because they're completely exhausted. They can barely make things work. They have the chance of making it, but having another kid could just completely destroy everything. So this is
Yes.
why. So this is kind of like you get sometimes very young girls seeking abortions, and sometimes it's these middle class 40-year-old women. The middle class 40-year-old woman who just needs an abortion to save the entire family structure, right? So
Yeah.
these are, and it's not like women. Most women make this decision lightly. I mean, there's a lot of
They
there's
do
a lot
not.
of
I know that for a fact.
yeah, there's a lot of thinking that goes into this. Should you have this child? What would this child be? I mean, you're starting to imagine things. What would this child look like? What personality mix would this child have? And it's like, it's not an easy choice. It's not like you're saying, yeah, just get it over with, whatever. I mean, some people are like this, but the majority surely isn't. And there's almost an impossibility to create a general rule. Just
Yes.
a rigid rule to say abortion is always wrong or abortion is always right. You can't make these fixed rules. But if we're all adults and we're all trying to make the best decisions that we can, there has to be some sort of flexibility. Because if you mess up, if things go bad, other people cannot take care of your problems. The state cannot take care of your problems, and other people who are struggling, they cannot take care of your problems. So the risk is always on you. So why shouldn't you have at least some degree of options, some degree of a safety net, just to get things right?
Alex, Alex, this is music to my ears because I've been thinking this for years and years and years. One of the biggest problems with American politics is number one, and it's been a growing problem for quite a bit of my lifetime, and both the left and the right feed into it in a toxic fashion where everything is these rigid slogans and talking points and formulas. And often these issues, whether it's economics, whether it's geopolitics, whether it's the relationship between men and women and raising families, is far more complicated. It's not a one size fits all solution. When it comes, and I think you illustrate the divorce and abortion issue correctly. And with abortion, I don't like abortion. I think it's a horrible thing. I think it's a horrible decision. I met a Christian lady before she accepted Jesus as her Lord and Savior through a mutual friend. And she had mentioned she had gone through an abortion back in the early 2000s before I met my daughter's mother, and we had our long marriage and relationship. I went on a date with a woman who also, and this was back when I was in my 20s, who had an abortion. And I've talked to these people who have had abortion. You're right, it is not a light decision. It does scar them psychologically and haunt them for a long time. I think we have to investigate why people are getting the abortions, and I don't hear that in the abortion debate. It's either ban or don't ban, and often the people that, for example, claim they're pro-life until the baby is born and outside the womb, and then once they're out of the womb, it's like no social safety nets, even the concept of earn but share prosperity, making your own money to support a family. Well, we can't support a union. If you don't like a job, too bad, shut up, work 10 jobs, change your job, and all the rest of it. Everything is on the onus is always on the powerless individual and never the powerful party that has more power and a lot more influence, and that should be using their power and exercising it in a much more judicious fashion. I think there's also in American politics, I think there's another huge problem, and that is the lack of empathy too, as well, on all sides, the left and the right. It's like when the left, they crap all over Bible-believing Christians and calling themselves, calling them fascists, for example, and haters, when that's clearly not always the case. I've met many Christians who are wonderful, decent, kind-hearted people, salt of the earth, that are clearly not fascist or racist or advocates of a Handmaid's Tale style theocracy. So to make it clear, it exists on the left and the right. There needs to be a lot more empathy. And that's why in my essay, my first essay on radical civic nationalism, it's purposely all inclusive, because I find in my walk and my journey in life that are good people of good faith on both sides, whether atheist or Christian, gay or straight, black, white, brown, Hispanic, yellow, Asian, whatever. I found good and bad people in all classes of society. I found that you have some of the poor people that are the most entitled and obnoxious people, but I found many poor and working class and middle class people that really could constitute a political elite in their country, because in our country, United States, because they're very intelligent, they're very patriotic, and they would give the shirt off the back to the person poorer to them. Just like when I was in the Coalition for a Prosperous America, for example, years ago, that organization had mostly dominated by business people, some of them very wealthy, but they were all patriots who invested in their communities. They expected a lot of their workers, but in return, they treated their workers very well. I mean, look at Mr. Revere from Revere Copper, to give you one person, very admirable person. Look at another business hero of mine, Aaron Feuerstein of Malden Mills, who I never met. Look him up. Very hard-nosed business people, but good. They're patriotic. They invested in their workforce. And as long as the workers put in a lot of effort, they were cool. Look at my dad, Mark Gussack, and my brother David Gussack, my great-grandfather Nathan Gussack, according to a family history that my cousin, one of my first cousins, wrote about my great-grandfather Nathan. People say that in some ways, I take after Nathan Gussack. He was a hard-nosed business person, but very, very kind-hearted. He also, according to, I think, one family history, also fought communist organizers off, too, in his factories that he had in Brooklyn and New York City. I'd have to pull that family history out just to make sure I haven't read it in a couple of years. But, so you have all these people, and you have American observers. I'm going to pick on Ben Shapiro. I really don't like him. I don't like how he comes across. He comes across as a condescending asshole. He might be right about a bunch of things, and he's a smart guy, but there's just something about him that rubs me the wrong way. And I know some of my coworkers listen to this. So, Heather, if I don't like somebody, I have to have a good reason, because a lot of people always say, and you always pick on me, Heather, I love you to death. You always say I like most people, even at the workplace, that I like most of my customers. I like everybody. So if I don't like somebody, it's pretty
There's a
bad.
reason
So
for
Mr.
it. Yeah.
Ben Shapiro said, empathy is actually kind of bad for politics. The reason that empathy is bad for politics is because it leads you to empathize with people that you are more likely to like, as opposed to people you don't like. And that, to me, just intuitively is a very weird statement. Number one, it's just, there's something wrong with it. I take a different approach with politics. I think you have to have balance of powers. I think you have to speak for vulnerable people who take responsibility, who do everything right, but yet still get screwed, for the lack of a better word. They don't have the right connections. They have bad luck. There are a lot of people that are also naturally unlucky. It doesn't have to be bad decisions
Yeah.
either
If you
that
look
they
at,
make.
I mean,
And
there's like a left wing way.
what do you think of the Shapiro quote? Doesn't that strike you as strange? The
I
Shapiro
haven't.
quote? What?
I don't know. I don't know this guy that much. I haven't really looked at much of what he's done over the years, except a few little bits and pieces when he talks about, Hamas versus Israel, or some general statements about, let's say Trump or the Democrats.
Mm-hmm.
So I really don't know much about this guy. It's just like, I know that he talked early in his career. He talked to these investors, and he had like this napkin business plan where he said, "You give me money, I make content, and then I promote it on social media, and that gets more money into it, and then it goes in a circle." And so that's how it happened. That's how he got the money. But it's like it doesn't work for it. It almost never works for anybody. So he may think that the system works really well because he's the living proof of that. But this is like what scientists would call the survivor's bias.
Came from a good family.
I'm
sorry to interrupt. He also came from a good family.
Oh, right.
Too,
yeah, of course,
Family.
exactly. So there's like it's a survivor's bias. So you can't really just look at those people, few people that made it in some ways, and say, look, their way of doing things totally worked, while there's so many other people that failed for multiple reasons, mostly or oftentimes outside of their own control. And there's a left-wing way and there's a right-wing way to destroy economic opportunities in terms of having an enterprise, having a company, just get something started yourself, or joining something that's up and coming, because it's legal to start a company. You can just, fill out some documents and you are incorporated, right? But in reality, almost nothing works these days, right? Because there's this left-wing regulation. It's especially bad here in Germany. There's so much left-wing legislation. You can basically never fire anybody unless there's absolute gross misconduct. If the worker you hired is becoming a lazy bastard and is creating all sorts of tension and is just an insufferable person and he's really harming the performance of the company, you cannot fire him. You're stuck with this person forever. Now, this was made in order to protect the employees, right? But there's got to be a balance. There's got to be some sort of a balance. Now, in America, it's kind of the other way around. You can fire people 6 ways to Sunday. You can just fire people.
Yes.
But it's also a problem if you cannot fire people. And there's so many other regulations, the eco regulations, the way you can grow something, the way you can import bananas. The bananas have to be in a certain way. There's rule books and laws for everything. It's become so complicated that an actual Brexit was even virtually impossible to do. They announced Brexit, but they could never really implement Brexit in Britain because the European law mixed with the British law is too complicated. There's a handful of people alive who are able to understand the law and could theoretically untangle it, but nobody else gets it because it's so complicated. So this is like how, from a left-wing perspective, you can destroy economic opportunities. So whether it's your own company or you're joining somebody else's company, how can you make a profit that way? How can you have a functioning team that way? It's becoming impossible. So the only thing that's working is, big corporations and hope for some, improvements, or you work for the government. And then there's a right-wing way, an elitist right-wing way of destroying enterprises and opportunities. And this is when you have these predatory corporations that don't even really make a profit. They got these institutionalized or super large investors behind them. They can squash all the competition and then just sort of kind of keep going. So how are you supposed to make or create a company or join a company to compete? How do you compete? You wanna have a company in the energy sector? You can pretty much forget about that. You want to try retail? You can forget about going against, let's say, Amazon. Anything to do with food? You want to go against Cargill? You want to go against Walmart? You can just forget about that. Specific fields in the industry, you can forget competing with these foreign nations. Or you want to make software. Everything's outsourced now to India and these other places, and artificial intelligence is going to be, programming the software of the future. So it's become functionally, essentially impossible in most cases to have a functioning company that is profitable. How many companies are going under? How many zombie companies exist in America and in Europe? Companies that barely survive. They loan new money, and then they loan new money to pay off the old loans. and they're sort of getting government subsidies to stay somewhat alive, but this is not a functioning economy. So there's like a left-wing way
Yeah.
of ruining everything, and there's a right-wing way of ruining everything, and we're expected to pick between, death by hanging and death by decapitation. You want to be hanged or you want to be decapitated? Which one do you like? This is your political choice, and that's of course not a real choice. And I see that with these Republican guys, I see that with these Democratic guys, and I also see that with these media influencers. When I remember some bits and pieces from Ben Shapiro when he says that, just go marry young and have a job and work and, try to make it in the system. At what company are you supposed to be successful at? Could you, you should ask Shapiro, okay, I'm a young guy. I'm in my early 20s. I have maybe a college degree. I'm ready to join the workforce. I want to become successful in the long run. I want to get married in my 20s, fairly young, have 5 children. That's my goal. So, Mr. Shapiro, where should I send my job applications to? What industry and how is this going to work out for me? And the only thing
What am I going to do?
Yeah, so the only
What
thing
am I going to do?
the only
What
thing
am
a
I
guy
going to
like
do when the
Shapiro
company?
can say, Shapiro can give you a bunch of generalized statements, I guess. Some dogmas and some nice sounding sentences, but that's not really fixing the problem.
Yeah, sorry about that, because I think you hit upon such a good point that was irresistible. Really not to respond to. My apologies if I cut in. I try not
No,
to as much as I can.
it's like this, exactly that kind of back and forth, and sometimes you have to butt in because otherwise
Yeah.
you're forgetting a point, right?
Yeah. So the thing is with Shapiro, the other thing is he supports, when you dig into his views on economics and whatnot. What do you do when the company decides to boost their stock price? Like one of Paul Singer's companies that he invested to, he's a major hedge funder and Republican donor, and he totally destroyed the workforce in one of the towns in Nebraska with the Cavallas, which was a sports gear retail outlet. And what do those people do? So you have your family, you get a job, you work hard, you do everything that's right, you're responsible. What do? Boom, you're in a town, you lose your job. And typically what they say is, oh, just move, get retrained, whatever. But all that costs money. And if you're working paycheck to paycheck, paying the bills and everything, maybe you have a little saved out, that wipes you out. Why? It's not because the company was doing badly. It's just that a group of hedge fund investors decided to say, you know what, I can make more money and boost the stock price of the company higher by laying off workers because labor costs are often very expensive. When you look at regulations, I'm for balance when it comes to everything else. The same thing with labor and capital. I don't like a society where the capitalists are overpower labor, but I also don't like a society where labor overpowers and bullies capitalism excessively too as well. So I'm against both. Thirdly, you have to look at also the cost of regulations. I agree, and that's something that a lot of the quote unquote free market people tend to focus in on. But there's also the cost of not regulating too. There's a lot of costs to the environment when you pollute a particular body of water. If you're a private company, or pollute the air, you can potentially impact other businesses like tourism, like your beaches, restaurants will require, very nice areas that are clean, recreational areas. You also poison the food industry, potentially agriculture, fishing, and things of that nature. So I kind of look at economics as an interconnected organism, if you will. So there was an MIT study from 1986, which kind of examined the costs of deregulation, and it really pinpointed the lack of American competitiveness, little to do with regulation at that time and more having to do with the short-term model that American big business started to undertake and accept. And we have people like Theodore Levitt and Michael Jensen and Milton Friedman to thank for this, shareholder-only value capitalism. When you're taught that the only fiduciary responsibility to a corporation is to its shareholders, that's something that is taught as absolute truth, but that was not absolute truth. And it's not absolute truth in other developed industrialized countries too, as well, that have relatively free economies. And that's something that I'm a little, you know, one of the things I disagree with this up and coming commentator and scholar, James A. Lindsay, who is against this ESG DEI. But if you listen to his interviews, he really doesn't. I think a lot of people are not dumb. I think it's just they just have either their pet beliefs or whatever, or they're paid to say certain things. I'm not saying that's the case with necessarily with Mr. Lindsay, but that's an issue. So we have to take a look at the costs of not only regulating or over regulating or protecting people that are grossly incompetent that should be fired. And I do believe that if you're such a liability on a business that you suck as an employee and you're lazy, and that does exist certainly, yeah, you should not have a right to that job. But you also have something in the United States called at will employment, of which Florida is a state that permits that. Minnesota, I don't think does, and there are other states that don't apply that. And the boss can just fire you just because the
At will.
way they looked at you wrong, and that needs to be really reviewed too. And I think when it comes to American politics, one of the things that I initially liked about Trump and where he just totally screwed up and he accepted the sort of conservative incorporated Kool-Aid, the Ben Shapiro view, to pick on Ben Shapiro again. One of the things I liked about Trump, and before he entered political office, he had made a lot of good points. And he said in a 1999 interview, I think that nobody's really hitting it right. The Democrats are too far left. The Republicans are too far right. I don't think anybody's hitting the chord, not the chord that I want to hear and not the chord that other people want to hear. And that's a huge problem. And that's why I give my analysis of Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. If people are expecting that I'm just going to crap all over them and call them just communists and that's the end of the story, you're not going to get that on this show. And if you're going to get and on the converse, on the other side, if you're going to have me just because I'm very pro-union, I am for re-regulating the economy and outlawing certain economic behaviors and transactions. And if you expect me to say that Kamala Harris and Tim Walz are the best things since sliced bread and overlook their really bad points or troubling points, then you're also mistaken too. Where I come from, and just to reinforce, I'm a radical civic nationalist. I like right wing goals. I like strong families. I love entrepreneurships and private property. It's not even we need a strong national defense and a strong domestic security posture too, as well. But I have felt, and when you go through the evidence, I feel that right wingers, most of your so called conservative right, their formula, the three legged stool of rapacious forms of capitalism, if you want to call it as such, I hate to put it so crudely, but sort of rapacious social Darwinist trickle down economics combined with a staunch religious conservatism that upholds families but is very rigid in many ways, and then also a strong national defense posture. It says, yes, let's have a strong conventional and nuclear force, but let's trade and give technology away to Russia and China. That doesn't make sense. If you subscribe to a capitalism that says, look, if some leverage buyout private equity hedge fund guy comes in, swoops in, throws all your people out of work to boost a stock price in a factory in the middle of rural America, and they say just move. Well, how does that comport with the conservative notions of community, child rearing, family, increasing the birth rate? That doesn't make sense to me. Maybe I'm a little slow or stupid. Maybe, as some of you might say, you don't know the first thing of economics.
Yeah, but
Well,
it's
economics, as
very,
commonly taught,
yeah.
is counterintuitive. And it's the same thing with national security. You're asking us to spend all this money on national defense and beefing up our military with the best weapons, but meanwhile, we're giving our technology and our economic destiny to Russia, at least previously, and still China. It doesn't make sense. So that's why I abandoned conservatism, just like with the far left. Ever since I was young, and they would always make statements and take positions that once the United States defeated in every war, basically to try and liberate the world or protect countries from communism or any other form of collectivist totalitarianism. So, and that's why that's why I always felt that the far left was basically spitting on the flag, spitting our security and survival of our nation, and taking the opposite extreme of Marxism, which Karl Marx calls for: the despotic inroads on private property, the abolition of the private owned means of production, the creation of industrial
Yeah.
armies, as he put it.
I think that's why it's
All
so
these.
important.
That's why I can't support either.
I think that's why it's so important for people, especially young people, but really everybody, um to get a thorough overview of these different ideologies and these different lifestyles. Sometimes you can have an experience yourself directly. So, for example, you actually when you're in college or before college or maybe a bit after college, when you're trying out a factory job for a while, or you're trying something else on for a while, you can get some real life experience. Or sometimes it's not necessarily a direct experience. You can grab a really good selected book about a specific reality to figure out how life is for different kinds of persons. And this is, at some point, you become mentally more flexible, and you can get a sense of how to fix problems for real. Because this is what's needed, I think, in American politics to try out different things and to figure out and to do things that you haven't done so far. So, for example, if you're if you're a run of the mill left wing guy, just maybe you should spend some time in a different community, for a vacation. You do some trip that's something like on the countryside, and you shoot a couple of firearms, and you meet up with the locals, and you just have a different experience, right? Or maybe if you're a country person, have a different experience, find out, do something you haven't done before. Doesn't mean you're gonna stick with it, but at least you've experienced it. You've seen something else, and just incorporate as many things as you can in your basket of experiences, because otherwise you're going to end up in this. You're going to be ending up in this bubble, just becoming more and more detached from reality. So, for example, the Shapiro bubble, right? When he's swimming in money, really, and then he's making millions per year. So his challenges are: am I going to invest in this? Am I going to buy that house? Do I need a new car? Or do I need to work more so I can afford more? Or do I want to work a bit less so I have more time with my family? That's kind of his life experience. So it's like, you need to understand how reality truly is for other people, to become more grounded and to become more more connected with reality. Because there's so many great things you can read, different jobs, different times, even different countries, or a show like this, right, where you can learn a bit about how crazy was it in Europe for such a long time. 1.5 millennia, one and a half millennia of complete craziness. And before that, you had the ancient world, which was also crazy. And how was life? How was life for these European people? Because many people nowadays in America, they don't even understand serfdom. They don't understand peasant serfdom. They're being taught, white people were always those mean guys who oppressed everybody else. Well, if you're a white person, 90% chance, like literally 90% chance, your ancestors were peasant serfs, which was not the exact same thing as a slave, but it was pretty close to a slave. There were different kinds of peasant serf, categories, but in general, you were a thing. You were somebody else's property, and they could sell you, they could trade you, even in places like Russia. I mean, Catherine the Great, who is like a favorite czar of Vladimir Putin. Catherine the Great, she gifted 400,000 people, 400,000 serfs, to various members of the aristocracy, because she wanted to rearrange the aristocratic system and benefit people that were more loyal to her. So she's just rearranging human lives, people. So it's like, okay, now you work for this guy, or you have to move your entire family to that other area because I just gifted you away. So by learning the actual reality of different people, or just listen, I mean, if you're not owning a company, if you're not running a company, if you're just a very regular employee who's not involved in this decision-making process of the leadership, try to find examples where you can read up on or watch something on how terrible it is, mostly, to run a company. I mean, it can be a nightmare to be an entrepreneur and not knowing what's going to happen next week, next month, in a year.
Yes.
You cannot predict the market most of the time, so you're banking, you're just betting on this, and then some other product becomes the new hot trend, and you're stuck with this thing that you chose. You can never really shut it off. If you're running your own company, you can never really stop thinking about your company.
You can't. You're married to the business.
Exactly.
And I'm glad you brought that. I'm glad you brought that up again. And apologize for the interjection, but I think it's important to have it fair on both sides. I mean, I know business people. There are a bunch of them are in my family. You look at even Yvette, my girlfriend, who is a real estate entrepreneur and a landlord. And even when you're making passive income, there are times where you're literally married to the business. The same thing with my brother, my father, who's at least partially retired, and other people on both sides of my family. You or my grandparents on my mother's side, you're married to that business. It's not all a bed of roses. And I think that's another problem is also, I think there needs to be, definitely on a state level, if not a national level, there has to be in the high school curriculum, people have to be taught real economics, not necessarily all theoretical economics, but why labor is important, why the investor, private investor, why the private owner of wealth, the consumer, why are they all important? What is it like to be in their shoes? I can criticize, rightfully so, you and I, certain types of capitalism, neoliberalism, or Reaganomics, whatever you want to call it. But the fact of the matter is, the reality is, even if you're a normal, regular capitalist that is producing a legitimate product or service, even the big hedge fund people, I did a summer internship on Wall Street back in the 1990s. And even then, whether we agree with their decisions, disagree, I mean, when it comes down to it, I have mixed opinions. I am not for abolishing Wall Street or finance capitalism per se. I don't agree with that for many different reasons. But with that stated, they were married to their jobs. They were there very early in the morning, crack of dawn, on the computers, watching the stock prices with the newspapers, because back then still print media was extremely important, along with the TVs. They were married to their work. And I think that's where the great American conservative Russell Kirk had a real good point when he stated that what we need in the United States are genuinely educated business people and genuinely educated trade union leaders. And I think there has to be genuine understanding of what the business people go through, the good ones as well as the bad ones, as well as also the laboring classes and the consumer too as well. I think that's really important. I think we need to rewire economics away from this notion of ideological claptrap. Either government is always the problem and never the solution, and then on the other extreme where government is always the solution and let's just crowd out the private sector. I don't buy either extreme. Both is bunk as far as I'm concerned, and it has not worked for the betterment of society, and particularly the laboring classes as a whole. So that's what we have to go back to, is the genuine education of really the proper role of all the economic actors / actresses, at least here in American society. I think that needs to be done in a mandatory sense at high school, because I think then that you're going to have a better understanding with the younger people going into the real world of how the economy actually works in the real world. So I'm so glad you brought that up, Alex. I think
there's an additional dimension to this, because I think that a lot of capitalist, so to say, history is shrouded in secrecy. There was a huge amount of secrecy, and there was and it's a painstaking process to try to reconstruct what had actually happened. Now, of course, when you look at the big industrialization drive in the United States in the 1870s, especially 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s, and then of course then in the following era. It was kind of the biggest industrialization drive, and it created all these jobs and opportunities, and then of course the new middle class and everything, the car industry. Obviously, America was then able to become, or America was able to become an intervention force in World War I and especially in World War II, because America was able to outproduce every other participant in the war combined. So what the Japanese were building, the Germans were building, America built more than everybody else combined. So of course there were significant benefits about that, but the left wing, of course, the left wing has described it all as a big conspiracy. This was just mean old imperialism, end stage capitalism, blah blah blah. Very simplistic explanation. And the conspiracy guys, the traditional conspiracy people. Conspiracy media has also described it as a big conspiracy led by some secret Jewish cabal, of course, even though if you look at American capitalism, if you look at DuPont, if you look at the Astors, if you look at the Rockefellers, there's like a staggering number of Anglo people, right? But for the conspiracy guys, of course, this was led by a handful of Jewish people from Europe. So two major groups, ideological groups, describe the American industrial drive as a conspiracy, and I think the actual answer is something else. There must have been a certain amount of secrecy and coordination, because this is kind of the only way that you could have a future for America and be able to compete. Because who knows what other countries might have done? I mean, imagine if Germany had not only turned crazy but became industrialized at an alarming rate, and then Germany would have maybe absorbed other places and became this big global threat. Just as an example, there could have been other empires becoming major threats. So it's like the ancient old question of how much of an empire do we have to be? Because not everybody else is playing by nice rules either. So we gotta have an industrialization drive, and I think there was certainly must have been some secret coordination circles in the U.S. And so this is how some corporations and also banks were able to break rules, bend some other rules, go against the grain of the Constitution sometimes to create these large trusts and these quasi-monopolies or these cartels. There was some coordination, there was a lot of secrecy, and when we're dealing with secrecy, there's a lot that depends on it if we can reconstruct the past correctly. Now, nowadays, when we have something like, or we got a president like Joe Biden, if I look at the family behind Joe Biden, which was the DuPont family, there was a lot shrouded in secrecy, because the DuPont family originally came from France, right? So there was this kind of privileged but still small family, and they were not getting along so well in France with the new government, and they made this kind of quick escape. They went on a boat, got all their stuff, and they almost starved on that boat. And they constantly were running around with their weapons on the boat because they were afraid the crew would just kill the DuPonts, toss them overboard, and take the money. So it was a very, very stressful travel to the United States. And then all of a sudden, this weird family from France was connected with some very powerful people in the American system. And that's when they started to get the gunpowder, these huge gunpowder contracts with the government, and became the dominant force with the gunpowder. And later they got, into the chemical business, even making, I think, a lot of materials for nuclear weapons. So they were showered with these government contracts. And if you take on these government contracts, there has to be absolute trust in that DuPont family. How do you establish trusts? What kind of a secret system was established to make sure that production would be guaranteed in the future and loyalty would be guaranteed in the future? So DuPont was allowed to get away with almost anything. I mean, at some point they had stupid, I mean, even though they got all this business, right? They still came up with stupid ideas. They said, "Oh, we use Teflon. We use Teflon in various ways. Can't we make frying pans with Teflon? Can't we make other things with Teflon? Coat everything, clothing, everyday items. Just coat everything with Teflon." And then they figured out it's toxic. You know, these chemicals accumulate. They can make people really sick. And these chemicals, you can't get rid of them inside of living organisms. So what do they decide? They decide to cover up most of this thing and find a way to get out of this problem cheaply, right? So they work with these politicians, and they got out of this. They got out of this problem with by taking manageable damage. You know, having a manageable cost attached to getting out of this problem. So it's like this huge issue of what was the actual history really like of American capitalism. And there's so many weird stories, because when I looked at some of these stories, it just didn't seem right sometimes. You know, for example, there was this supposed broke guy from Europe, I think even Germany, Mr. Astor, Johann Jakob Astor, the Astor family. So a broke guy supposedly comes to America, immediately is a member of these elite Masonic lodges in America, and then starts to dominate the fur trade and becomes like a major player in North America. Supposedly, the family became the richest family in the United States. Eventually, members of the family would go back to Britain and take on aristocratic titles. So was this really rags to riches? Was this really the true story of the first Astor? Or was there a network behind Astor? Maybe a British network, who knows? A network using Astor in America? I would like to know, because I'm thinking like an intelligence analyst, and that's why I want to know. Same with the Rockefellers. I mean, the Rockefellers had no idea about oil and refining oil and to make oil into something better. And then they had these guys around them providing the seed money and providing the patents. There was also a guy attached to these British circles who was the initial genius behind Rockefeller Standard Oil. So was this a naturally occurring corporation? Were they just doing things better than everybody else, or was there a network behind Standard Oil who provided the seed money, the contacts, and the talent, the scientists with the patents? Because if you control these things, you can make any corporation and make it dominate, especially at that age. So we don't actually know the true story of capitalism in general, not the full story anyway. So I would caution people, tell them to be careful when we draw conclusions nowadays by using historical arguments, because we have not reconstructed the actual past yet. So we cannot really say, well, the past was like this, therefore we gotta do that nowadays. We can't be 100% sure, so we gotta take a really close look at these things. Not rely on these leftist explanations of every capitalism is a conspiracy and it's all parasitic and evil,
Right.
and not listening to this traditional conspiracy mythology, which claims to be these people claim to be intelligence experts, but they have very little idea at all about the intelligence world and the intelligence history. They just pretend to be experts on this.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that. I couldn't agree with you more. The history of capitalism is very complicated. It's usually there's a combination of the rags to riches, there's these outside sources, is even you inheriting money or coming from a good, solid upper middle class or middle class background, having the opportunities, but then you building upon it because you're smart, you're lucky, a combination of both, you provide a good product or service and have a good marketing strategy, or you might know the right people in the right places. There's so many factors here, both based on individual initiative and intelligence and resourcefulness and thrift and hard work, but there's also a lot of outside factors too that have nothing to do with necessarily you as an individual or your ideas. So the history of capitalism, I think, is complicated. As to the anti-capitalist critics, the biggest issue I have with the anti-capitalist critics, the hardcore ones, I'm not talking about critics of capitalism like you or I, because really we're critics of capitalism without becoming full anti-capitalist or anti-capitalist at all. I suspect you want to just tinker with the system, but essentially reform it, refine it a bit, very similar to me too as well. Um, the problem with the Leninist critics of capitalism is they are full-fledged tyranny with massive human rights violations, and they want to abolish all forms of private property. I really don't have to preach why to this audience for the most part, or to you why that's a bad idea. The other part is that the Leninists also tend to be while being very critical of capitalism, they use capitalism and the capitalists in order to enhance their own power, and that smacks of extreme forms of opportunism and a betrayal of their stated revolutionary ideals. Now, with the conspiracy elements come across all flavors. You have obviously the left and left wing sort of Marxist Leninist or extreme forms of socialist critics of capitalism, as well as fascist or National Socialist critics of capitalism. They have their own conspiracy theories. There's always grains of truth in it, but it never tells the full story, and they propose solutions that are worse than the problem. The other side of the equation is you have the conspiracy conspiracy theory oriented analysts. Let's take like the John Birch Society and forces allied with them. Look, I was in the Birch Society. There are many different things that I've learned that I got positive from my time in the Birch Society. I never encountered personally any anti-Semitism or racism. I was with the chapter with Ed and Diane Clements in upstate New York in Ballston Lake, which is north of Schenectady and Albany. Um, my critique of the society is based on certain historical interpretations and analysis that I have. The problem with their conspiracy point of view is they have a lot of very good research and a lot of good information more often than not. The problem is I started to do my own research on top of reading their recommended sources, and I've kind of come to different conclusions. They really don't first of all, their solution is very contradictory. They are critics of the bankers and the corporate globalists, if you will, the insiders, as they will call them,
Some
years
bankers,
ago.
not all of them.
Some
Some
exactly like
billionaires, not all of them.
very true. And the thing is that they propose solutions of less government, which is unsatisfactory because in order to curb private power, you need a countervailing force to keep aggregated, unaccountable private power in check, the way they describe the Rockefellers and whatnot. So they proposal, like Gary Allen in the 1970s, who was one of their lead author scholars slash theorists, would say all these great things about the greed of the bankers and doing business with the communist countries and everything, but yet they support this deregulatory framework that basically removes the layer of countervailing power that used to exist in an imperfect form, like destruction of unions. He blamed them for the lack of competitiveness and all the rest of it. And that's a problem. One of the positive aspects of the right wing elements, right wing social democrats in the AFL-CIO of Lane Kirkland and George Meany is they actually were a very powerful force that really that raised the alarm of communist aggression throughout the world and the buildup of Soviet and Chinese military power. And even today, the AFL-CIO to some degree still is in the lead forefront against that issue as well. So I look at the Birchers, and again, it's this contradictory formula. You can't have this total withdrawal of state power from the economy and the political process of holding big business accountable and checking their power sometimes when it harms national security or sometimes economic stability as a whole. So that's my issue with the Birchers. Really, what I found is just intellectual disagreement. The other part, of course, and this is off topic, is there are journals like the New American and the American Opinion, which is very weird because in their scoreboards they would lambaste Western European social democratic countries as moving on the path of communism, and even under the Christian Democrats. But then the governments like Rafael Trujillo or Anastasio Somoza or Chiang Kai-shek and others that they hail as heroes, and certainly they were under assault by communist countries, particularly Somoza and Chiang, for example, and communist terrorist groups like the Sandinistas and the Chinese Communist Party of Mao Zedong. But they view them like as these sort of, exponents of freedom or against dirigiste, meaning statist economic policies, like Gary Bonneau in a New American article lumped in Ludwig von Mises, who's, an exponent of political and economic laissez-faire liberalism, with that of Chiang Kai-shek and Syngman Rhee of China and South Korea, and other these sort of what I term right-wing collectivist leaders that are very anti-capitalist. They developed a lot of state-owned industries. When you look at the theory, the political economic theory of the Kuomintang, as well as in South Korea under Rhee's Liberal Party, they had an ideology called Il-min-chui, which preached a rejection of capitalism and communism and in favor of this sort of authoritarian style Korean democracy, as some of their theorists like An Ho-sang and others have argued. I talked about it in my book, When Right Means Left. I kind of take a deep dive into this. So when I started to read this, and I understand why they were under threat, but they had this unique ideology that they held near and dear to their heart for a variety of reasons. And when you're calling something, against statism, dirigiste economics. Now, von Mises was against that, and he was very principled for that. But Syngman Rhee and Chiang Kai-shek and Somoza and other people,
Yeah.
no, the facts are very different.
There's
So that's another intellectual disagreement with I have the Birchers. And I know some of the Bircher people. I've met some of their writers. They're really good people, very smart people who I personally and professionally hold in high regard. But we have to be honest with our historical analysis, and that's where I part company with the Birchers on those intellectual disagreements I have.
When I looked at the Birchers, I mean they had all the classical or they were running into certain problems, like for example when it was about the Birch Society's stance on Freemasonry, right? So this became at some point an actual problem in the Birchers, because one group was thinking that way and the other group was thinking a completely different way. So and this is how kind of like this influence of traditional conspiracy literature, this very problematic influence that became an issue with the Birchers. So for example, somebody started to do this almost like activism, like this destructive activism against parts within the Birch Society, against Birchers, saying these guys are Freemasons. How can we be against conspiracies if some of our members or leaders, if they are Freemasons? And then the official answer came, we don't have a rigid stance on Freemasonry. Some members or even leaders are Freemasons. What's the problem with that? But then, of course, the Birch Society allowed this influence of traditional conspiracy mythology, which was very anti-Masonry, because it told people that Freemasonry was a Jewish plot, was a Jewish invention. That this was kind of like the elders of Zion trying to dominate everything through Freemasonry. And so this goes back to these very old books saying that Masonic ritual was deeply Jewish, when it was just kind of like an entry point into the ancient world. So the obvious choice was to use a bunch of little tidbits from the Old Testament, because that's kind of like an opening gateway into the ancient world, a gateway that seems fairly benign. And of course, for millennia, or for 2 millennia, people have been very interested in the ancient world. So it's not a Jewish conspiracy just because it takes these tidbits from the Old Testament, for some of these rituals. And Jews did not invent the ancient world either, right? So if you look at all these Masonic influences like Rome or ancient Greece or Egypt and whatnot, you look at these influences of Freemasonry, that was not invented by Jewish people either. So it's not a Jewish conspiracy, so to say. So, but that became a problem within the Birch Society, even though the Birchers were supposed to be able to give a precise, concise answer. Right? They should have been able to handle that question internally about Masonry, and even in public, and say, look, it's like this. People are interested in the ancient world. Some people like Freemasonry, and it just gets them in contact with other like-minded people, and it's very tied to science anyway. So a lot of scientists like Freemasonry anyway. That's not a problem at all. It only becomes a problem. It only becomes a problem when some other group is using Masonry as a vehicle, and you can use anything as a vehicle. Now, for intelligence networks, usually it's the more boring the vehicle, the better, right? Because you can use anything for espionage, anything and everything. The more boring the tool you're using or the vehicle you're using, the better it is to hide your operations. So it's like, and if any vehicle can be used for intelligence or espionage, obviously Masonry can be used for that. And there's all kinds of different Masonic systems. And the thing you should be aware of is these old aristocratic spy networks. That's a fairly recent field of research. Most people never even questioned or looked into the existence of old aristocratic intelligence. So this is something that I would have expected from the Birch Society, especially in the later generations. And nowadays, they should have been able to explain that to people. It's not a problem if you're a Freemason. It's a problem if you're a Freemason or something else attached to something else that may be nefarious. And no, it's not a Jewish invention, even though it takes some cues from the Old Testament. And let's be precise about what the problem is, right? And so I didn't see that ability back then. And I haven't seen much progression since then in the Birch Society, even though science has moved on. We know a lot more now than we knew 60 years ago, or 50 years, or 40 years ago. So it's I expected more from them, but they kept fighting each other over questions like Freemasonry, or how to, suddenly they started attacking President Eisenhower. And that became a problem.
Yeah.
Should we attack Eisenhower? Should we not attack Eisenhower? They should have been able to answer that question. They should have been able to come up with a way to, talk about Eisenhower and the Republican Party and say these are good things within the party, and these are bad things possibly within the party, or things that we question, and we need to find a good strategy.
Yeah, the Birch Society, I mean, they're an expression intellectually of the old pre-World War II, pre-Cold War American right. You look at the books that they tend to sell by John T. Flynn, by authors that are skeptical about the circumstances surrounding the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. I mean, they definitely were not pro-Axis, and they're not pro-National Socialist or pro-fascist ideologically, but they have this sort of old right skepticism of, quote, foreign interventionism in different wars, whether World War I, World War II, etc. When it comes to, and they're really a product of that. And Eisenhower, was a mixed bag, and I've thumbed through and read parts of The Politician by Robert Welch. It is a Very well footnoted book, very heavily footnoted, to give him credit. Um, but really, ideologically, Robert Welsh and the Society represents a conservatism that is at odds with the entirety of the Eisenhower's Republican Party, if you will, during the 1950s. And really, there's just a major disagreement on the role of government, as well as some of Eisenhower's actions that did hurt the United States and were horrible, like Operation Keelwall during World War II, his role with that. Under the Allied powers, particularly in Britain and the United States, and then also his reciprocal trade treaties in the 1950s, which was a Cold War strategy, which in some ways hurt the United States because that's when the export of American industries and jobs started. And Welsh was credited in The Politician, I believe it was in The Politician, that he cited one really good Republican senator, Senator George Malone of Nevada, who was an avowed protectionist and economic nationalist. And Senator Malone wrote a book called, I think it's called Mainline, where he talks about the effects of what was first Truman and Eisenhower's reciprocal trade treaties. That's why they're called the Reciprocal Trade Agreement or Reciprocal Trade Act. So, and there were other things that Eisenhower's administration did, for example, that turning Cuba over to Fidel Castro in the 26th of July movement. And that was based on disinformation by elements within the State Department, Roy Bottom and William Wyland and others. So there's a lot of issues. And the Birch Society, they did recommend good sources like former U.S. Ambassador to Cuba, Earl E.T. Smith, who was anti-Batista as well as anti-Castro, and he warned the Eisenhower administration. So the Birchers point that out. One other thing with their conspiracy talk, they often don't talk about the actors, the motivating actors themselves, really what motivates them. They talk about the conspiracy, but they don't. This is not an unfriendly criticism per se, but they don't talk about, like, for example, what I talk about with the quote unquote corporate globalists. Like, for example, Sam Polk, who was a very wealthy hedge fund trader in New York, who wrote a tell all article in the New York Times, and he described really what him and her colleagues was like, that they had this lust for power and access and the wealth, and he was a fireball of greed. And really, I would like to see really a deep dive on really the motivations of David Rockefeller. And I think part of the problem is that I would argue that these insiders, it's really just their conduct and their positions are really in part the result of uncontrolled, unaccountable forms of corporate capitalism and corporate and global capitalism. And I think that's a truth they don't want to speak, because they have to maintain this idea they're for less government and for a better world, but they always say less government in their slogan, and they talk about the Constitution.
Yeah.
But then when they don't talk about the need for countervailing power, really, to tell you the truth, to really keep these in check. Look, I'm not for getting
I
rid of
think that, yeah, and I
multinational
think that
corporations,
it's,
but there needs to be better oversight. And that's another challenge I have. Look, there's a lot of good things they expose me to. The Jewish issue, they're very, the Birchers, I have not met any anti Semitic Birchers. They are not into racism. I'm going to give the recollections I have. I do apologize for going on. The Ed Clements and Diane Clements and Ed Suriano and others, these are really good people. It's my experience. There was a local speaker, Joe Vieira, who did a lot of prophecy talks and whatnot, and he talked about the New World Order, and he would always cite the newspaper called The Spotlight. Now it's known as the
yeah,
American Free Press. And that's by Liberty Lobby, which is a pseudo-populist group that is a reality national socialist. It was led one time by and founded by Willis Carto. And Ed Clements was like, "Do not read that garbage. I don't know why Joe Vieira promotes it and whatnot." And he told that to Scott Pearson and his lovely mom. I forget her name, Mrs. Pearson. I remember this like almost like clear as day. And he also was not a fan of Willis Carto and other neo-Nazis. He called one of the books that Carto promoted was this National Socialist book that promoted something called ethical socialism. It's an the book was called Imperium by Francis Parker Yockey, and Ed Clements said, "Yeah, that book is basically populist
Yeah.
socialist garbage. It's anti-Jewish and
When I looked
racist."
at
So there was this view, but what happened was is there were other members of the society that either resigned or were expelled because they believed in anti-Semitism, and then they moved into this racial collectivism that had a lot of socialist or fascist collectivist ideologies like Revelo Oliver, Tom Metzger, the head of and founder of the World Church of the Creator, Ben Clausen. And when you read their books, it's totally at variance with stated Birch ideologies. But then you have our friend and fellow analyst, J.R. Nyquist, who was also involved with the Birch Society. And I know he spoke about this at length publicly on this. And I find him a trustworthy man. You and I have worked with him. He has no reason to lie. He's pretty straight shooter, whether I agree with him or not all the time, and very transparent gentleman. I have a high regard for Jeff personally. And he had recounted, I'll let him retell his story, but he recounted that John McManus had basically uttered in confidence this weird ass conspiracy
mm,
theory that, and I've thought I've read them all, but he had a real whopper. And McManus never utters it in public, but apparently in private he does. And of course, if he uttered it in Birch Society as a whole, there would be a revolt, and they would throw him out of his position at the time when he was the head of the John Birch Society and then the public relations director beforehand. So the Birchers, it's an interesting group. There's a lot of good to it, but there's a lot of intellectual disagreement that I have. They do have people that have graduated, shall we say, from the Birch ideology, which is less government, shooting all the way to Strasserite National
mm.
Socialism, like Tom Metzger, who was even semi-pro-Soviet. And then you have people like Ben Clausen, who called for racial socialism with a very elitist framework and extreme genocide
Yeah,
against
it
non.
seems like there seems to be like a lack of uh, scientific progress in understanding these issues. Because of course it's one thing if you get something wrong in the 60s, but if you also get the same thing still wrong in the 70s and the 80s and then the 90s and the 2000s, that's becoming a problem. So for example, what I think the Birch Society, what the Birch Society has always gotten wrong was the writings of Professor Carroll Quigley, right? Because he was connected to these Anglo people, and he was kind of he thought he was in an inner circle, but he was not he was not as much of an insider as he thought he was, and so Quigley was particularly concerned with the secret circles of Britain and also reaching into the US, these secret decision-making circles that had messed up in a big way, especially when it came to deceiving the Nazis and for a time appeasing the Nazis. So this was kind of a plan that was hatched out in Britain in secret. It was a strategic idea. People thought we're just going to play nice with the Nazis, and so the Nazis will leave us alone. The Nazis would leave Britain alone and look elsewhere. And so Quigley was concerned that these secret circles would make the wrong decisions and have no accountability and would continue to make false decisions, potentially false decisions in the atomic age. So that was very concerning to Quigley. And also Quigley was starting to suspect that the Cold War may have had stalled into a quasi cartel, which is a risk in and of itself. So there were very interesting ideas by Quigley, and he was explaining, of course, how empires developed in certain stages. And so then the Birchers were claiming that Quigley was an evil insider, like this cackling evil guy who was bragging about being part of a conspiracy, which was nonsense. he was
Hmm.
he was calling for transparency. That's what Quigley meant when he talked about. I agree with many things, many goals of these secret Anglo circles. I like these circles. I like the Anglo way of life, but I think they should be more open and public. Therefore, that's what he meant. We can reduce any serious mistakes. We have more accountability and we can prevent another big fiasco. But these Birchers, they kept misquoting him. They were saying, no, he's an evil insider. He admitted to the big conspiracy. And it's like this traditional conspiracy that others had written about. And and they were never actually able in these Bircher cycles, I think, to correct that false assessment of what Quigley was saying. And also, when you look at the elder Skousen's book, I think it was The Naked Capitalist, and you look at Gary Allen's
Yeah, and the Naked Communist.
The Naked Communist, and when you look at Gary Allen's book that became a multi-million bestseller, a very essential part of these books is these false legends about the Rothschild banking family. It was just lifted
Yes.
verbatim from older conspiracy books, and it's so important to understand how false this mythology is and who really created this mythology to confuse people. So it's one thing if the Birchers were not able to look through these deceptions in the 60s and 70s, but I don't think they have really progressed since then, even though we have so much new research right now. There's new studies from Austria, from Austrian professors. There's stuff that I found out a lot, actually. We can actually trace that who created this traditional conspiracy mythology was largely Britain for a long time. British intelligence, which was far more developed than we previously thought. I mean, I was surprised at this as well. So there needs to be a progress, and you cannot repeat the same mistakes that you made in the 60s. You got to stay fresh and you got to stay new. And this is how you can make, I think, most members happy and productive by saying, okay, yeah, we made some mistakes, but now we understand, yes, there were other actual intelligence networks back then, in the Middle Ages and that sort of stuff. So, yeah, we were wrong about the Rothschilds, completely wrong about the Rothschilds because the crown was running the Rothschilds. But now we understand more about old intelligence networks. Isn't this progress, right? So this is how you actually make progress, because they literally say in these Birch books, Naked Communist, the Skousen book, and the Gary Allen book, they say it was these little Jewish banking families, and they were behind all these European wars for hundreds of years. They could get everybody fighting with each other as if they didn't have enough reason to fight each other, and scheme and try to find the money for the next war and have an alliance to squash a weaker alliance. So these are like mistakes have been made, right? So you got to fix them, and you got to get something better, make something better instead of just repeating the old thing.
Yeah.
And then even have infighting, because one Bircher group says, oh my God, it's the Jews, and the other group says, what are you talking about? And it's the Freemasons, we hate Masons. No, Masonry is okay if you're just not connected to some weird, crazy stuff. It's like, yeah, that's why we have progress, and people teach intelligence separately from history, separately from political science, and separately from economics, and it has to be part of all of that. You got to understand intelligence. I'm at the end of my time here. I think
No problem.
we got 3 hours. Yet again, we made actually 3 hours of really cool material. So I'm finished with my notes here. If you got anything left that we haven't
Yeah,
covered
just
yet?
to summarize, to mention quickly, one area with the society, they're both right on to a degree, but also, in my opinion, I've come to different conclusions than them, is on the Trilateral Commission and the Council on Foreign Relations. And look, those organizations like the World Economic Forum, they have tremendous amount of power. They need to be investigated and reined in ultimately by the United States government, by representatives and senators that are not bought and paid for by those very same interests. So they don't have that kind of leverage. But I hate to say it, and I know there are Birchers that might listen that really will get mad at me for saying this, but there are certain overlaps that the Birch Society has in common with the Trilateral Commission. For example, in the report entitled The Crisis of Democracy, the Trilateral Commission argued that there is an excess of democracy and therefore requiring some measure of apathy and non involvement on the part of some individuals and groups. Now, the Birchers are not for political apathy, but they do not believe in democracy of any kinds. They always say we're a constitutional republic. And here, the Trilateral Commission is actually
Yeah.
condemning, quote, the excess of democracy. The also is a very good thesis, for example, by Lance Mason called "Neoliberal Social Policy in the United States Before Reagan." There's also a very good report called "The Trilateral Commission" by Business Managed Government on www.herinst.org. Business Managed Democracy, Government International Trilateral. And they talk about how the Trilateral Commission, they were for wage suppression, lowering wages. They felt that the public sector unions caused a lot of the inflation of the 1970s. They were for the deregulation starting under Carter and Reagan of trucking, railroads, and the airline industries. They definitely believe in austerity and the reduction of welfare benefits. They were also for free trade. Now, the Birch Society was kind of split on that. They also supported the Back to the Basics movement in education, which resulted in the increased focus on standardized testing in school at the expense of other subjects, which is a mainstay of Republican Party education policy. So I'm looking at all this stuff, and there
Yeah.
is the trial out. You see where the Birchers, I'll say in closing about the Birch Society, and then I'll make quick concluding remarks. The Birch Society, in some ways, yes, have a lot in common with Karl Marx because they advocated economic interdependence and trade and technology transfers with China, with the Soviet Union, with the Russians, and whatnot. But they also have more in common with the Koch brothers, especially
Oh
domestically
yeah.
and on foreign trade. They have more in common with the Koch brothers than they do Karl Marx. And that's why I say in an upcoming Substack research that I have here from all my notes. And that's another thing. As you start to really unwrap these issues, that's where I think the Birchers on a number of issues, they make good points. They have good information. They have some information that I don't agree with or are questionable. I'm not going to go into that now at this point for the sake of time. But I've come to different conclusions that they have. And I think, and that's where I part company with them. And I don't take the conspiracy view of history. I don't think I do that. I'm reading all this information here. I'm going into deeper motivations. I'm going into actual policies that these organizations and interest groups support. And we go from there. These issues are very complicated. I think when it comes to the election here, Tim Walz and Kamala Harris, I mean, they are candidates that are deeply concerning to me. Yes, there are aspects of policies, what they state or claim they support, that I agree with. There are encouraging statements, but there are very, very deep concerns I have about Mr. Walz, particularly on certain national security issues that are very important, as well as Kamala Harris, too, as well. Is she going to be another Clinton and Obama, where she's going to give geopolitical enemies a little bit more of an edge, even though she kind of says the right things on Venezuela or North Korea and Russia, Ukraine? What is she going to do? That I don't fully trust her because I think she's an opportunist, basically, based on the information that I have provided. Um, and Tim Walz, while there are certain domestic state reforms I agree with him on, there are other issues of aspects of foreign policy. There are certainly a support for the legalization of marijuana, his positions on partial open borders when it comes to amnesty for undocumented illegal immigrants and whatnot, and DREAM Act. There are concerns that I have because a nation without borders is not a nation at all, in my opinion. I am for immigration, but it needs to be regulated and there needs to be a better balance. There needs to be also reforms to immigration, like the backlog of cases in immigration courts. You have unaccountable people that have, let's say, tourist visas or education visas that have expired. Where are these people? What intelligence threats do they potentially pose, or law enforcement criminal threats do they pose? At least some of them. So that's a concerning issue for me too, as well. And you had basically kind of a mixed economically populist but woke left candidacy of the Democrats on one side, which is a mixed bag of very good and very troubling and very bad. And the same thing with Trump and Vance, where Trump and Vance they had a very promising convention in many ways. They had Sean O'Brien, of the head of the Teamsters, who's a fierce fighter for workers and a real patriot, speaking there. I think that was a brilliant move by the Trump campaign. But now, in going attack mode on Kamala Harris and Tim Walz, they are really screwing things up big time. They are sounding more like rather Ben Shapiro than really a pro labor, pro family, anti communist, pro blue collar, but pro American business um, campaign that Trump ran on in the Republican primary and the general election in 2015 and 2016. And we look at the Trump administration's record, it was also very mixed. There was a lot of good things that they did, particularly on national security and foreign policy. But they brought in people like Gary Cohn and Larry Kudlow and people from American Enterprise Institute and the Heritage Foundation, and Wall Street elements that were very pro-China, like Stephen Schwarzman and Gary Cohn and others that did a lot of business with Beijing, and that's deeply troubling. So really, look, vote your conscience, vote who you think is going to be ultimately the best candidate. Nobody is going to be perfect. I saw the anti-communist roundtable that you, Jeff, John Robin, and others. I agreed with everything that all of you said had more than grains of truth. And unfortunately, there's no party that represents my ideas. That has been extinguished in the Democratic Party a long time ago in the 1970s. And the Republican Party, once basically Reaganism took over, that basically spelled doom for the old school Republicanism of the Abraham Lincoln and Teddy Roosevelt, and aspects of Eisenhower Republicanism I agree with. A lot of that has been pushed out by Reaganism, or as it's called, fusionism. So that's why I'm politically homeless. So you have to make the best decision.
So
Who's
I
going to
would
be the
call it
strongest on national?
politically compatible. That's what I would call it.
Yeah,
Because you can connect to different kinds of people, uh, I think like at least 2/3 of the country, you could connect with easily, right? I mean, there's always going to be the crazies who are in a cult mindset, and they would never touch anybody with a 10-foot pole, who is not really fully on board. But I think that it's more like politically compatible. You can jive with like 2/3 of the country.
yeah, I would think so too. Talking with everyday people that are not engaged or politically tribalistic in either party, I would tend to agree with you on that. But that's why I have my podcast, to try and give a voice to people like myself, and to the voters out there. You have to vote for, probably at the end of the day, who's going to be ultimately the best for national security, and which is the most important constitutional function. In the preamble of the Constitution, it says the common defense. And I'll just leave the audience at that point with that advice. And I want to thank you once again for a great show, Alex. You always provide a wealth of information, a wealth of great points and whatnot. Things definitely to think about. It's a pleasure having you.